Unholy Night. A Project Demon Hunters holiday novella. By Christine Pope. Chapter 1. I still can't believe we got this place, Rosemary said as she looked upward and then all around her, not sure which glorious detail of the interior she should take in first. The house just outside Santa Barbara, mansion really, with its 12,000 square feet and numerous bedrooms and bathrooms, appeared even more impressive now that she and Will were able to see it in person rather than merely from online photos. High ceilings of white plaster arched overhead, reminding her of pictures of cathedrals in Spain, and the hallway that led away from the enormous double front doors felt as if it went on forever. It's pretty impressive, Will agreed. He held an overnight bag in one hand and had a garment carrier in the other, and he flashed her a quick grin as he added, "But I think I'd prefer to hold off on the explorations until we've had a chance to put all this stuff away." "Oh right," Rosemary said quickly. She had her own overnight bag with her, but she'd left the bulk of her luggage in the car's trunk, figuring they should get settled in their room before she started hauling in everything else. Wedding dresses and their accompanying accessories took up a hell of a lot more space than she'd ever dreamed. It had all happened with almost dizzying speed. Sure, she and Will had been engaged for more than 18 months now, but neither of them had been inclined toward a hasty wedding, and they'd felt it was fine to take their time while discussing possible venues and all the other details. No, it was her sister Isabel who'd eloped. She and her now husband Fred Penasco had disappeared for a long Las Vegas weekend back at the beginning of this past summer, and had returned from their trip with Isabel flashing a new diamond band on her left hand. Of course, their parents and her sisters hadn't been too happy about the stealth nuptials, and had been hoping that Isabel and Fred would have taken the time for a real ceremony that everyone could have attended. But Izzy had only said that since this was her second marriage, it just felt better to do something without a lot of hoopla involved. Rosemary and Will, on the other hand, wanted to have a real wedding. Not at All Saints, the Episcopal church where he was a priest, because although she loved the depth of his faith, even if she didn't share it, raised pagan as she was, she also wanted to have a more intimate ceremony that would feel like it was especially for the two of them, and not something she'd have to share with his congregation. No, her dream had been to have a wedding that would be held in a historic place with a lot of character. And while they'd done their share of exploring venues in Southern California, nothing ever felt quite right. Or at least, the places she liked the best were way out of their budget, even if she was sitting on a decent nest egg after selling her house in Glendora and moving in with Will in his Orange Heights house in Pasadena. A lot of the money from the house sale, though, was already earmarked for remodeling and expanding his vintage home, which meant there was no way in the world she was going to sign up for a wedding that would have ended up costing north of 70 grand or even more. But Vista de los Robles, a magnificent estate perched in the hills above Montecito and built in the 1920s, offered the perfect setting Rosemary had been looking for. True, she hadn't thought she could ever afford that sort of venue, but her brother-in-law Fred, who positively excelled at locating the most arcane information on the internet that you could ever hope to find, had seen the property's website and passed along the relevant details to her. The site had been booked for the weekend before Christmas, but the wedding that was supposed to have been held there had fallen through, leaving the property owners with a vacancy at what should have been a busy time of year for them. Because of that, and because of the short notice involved, they'd offered the place for half off the regular price. Which was why, barely a month after they'd returned from Santa Fe, where they'd helped Penny Briggs and Isaac Zamora defeat the demon Lord Belial once and for all, the whole gang was trooping a few hours north of LA to celebrate Rosemary and Will's nuptials. Or at least, the rest of the group would be here soon enough. Because Audrey Barrett and Michael Covenant, her husband, were still living in Tucson, they decided to fly into LAX and then rent a car so they could drive up the coast, and they planned to get to Santa Barbara sometime tomorrow. Will's parents were slated to arrive on Friday, as were Rosemary's two sisters and their husbands, along with her nephew Tyler, Celeste's little boy, who'd been given the all-important job of being the ring-bearer during the ceremony. For now, Rosemary and Will would have the enormous 12,000 square foot house to themselves, and she thought she knew exactly what she wanted to do with it. "Let's go check out the bedroom," she said with a grin.
Will had to admit that the house was magnificent. Even though they were getting the place for half price, $3,000 a night still seemed insanely extravagant to him, especially since no one else would even be staying here until tomorrow, and he and Rosemary would be rattling around the place alone in the meantime. But although he'd pitched in as much as he was able, she was covering most of the tab for the wedding, which meant he needed to relax about the cost involved and let her enjoy herself. The master suite, with its balcony that allowed astounding views of the wooded grounds and the Pacific Ocean beyond, was better than anything he could have possibly imagined, or maybe that was simply because of the way he and his fiancée had amused themselves for the past couple of hours. Now, though, they were showered and had changed their clothes and gone back down to empty the trunk of his 1970 Barracuda, which was big enough to hide a couple of bodies in and still had been stretched to its limit thanks to all the luggage Rosemary had brought along. He would never have thought of her as a maximalist kind of person, despite her fun and funky wardrobe, but as he dutifully carried bag after bag up the sweeping staircase to their suite, he had to wonder if she'd emptied half their closet in preparation for this weekend. Eventually, though, everything was put away or hung up, with her securing the garment bag that concealed her wedding dress in the deepest, darkest corner of the walk-in closet. "Don't you dare peek," she said in only half-teasing tones, and he grinned. "I have no intention of ruining the surprise," he replied, and bent down to press his lips against hers. Even now, after being together for more than 2 years, he still found himself astonished that someone so bright and beautiful and passionate had agreed to join her life to his. He'd just have to do his very best to let her know every single day how honored he was to be with her. "Good," she said, still looking a little stern. "I suppose we should explore a bit. After that, though, do you want to order in, or should we go into town to explore?" Since he hadn't been to Santa Barbara in years, part of him thought it might be fun to go downtown and check out the restaurants there, maybe walk on the beach. On the other hand, it seemed almost wasteful to leave this magnificent house standing empty for even a few hours. "Order in," he said. "If that's okay with you. It just feels better to stay here." Her clear blue-gray eyes twinkled. "I'm fine with that. Besides, we've got all those bottles of wine we brought along. It'll be fun to open one of the whites and have some of it on the patio before dinner." Yes, that sounded like a great idea. Although Rosemary had been nervously checking the weather reports for the last 2 weeks, fearing the arrival of a storm that would ruin their outdoor ceremony, the rain had graciously stayed away, and the skies outside were a soft, clear blue, the temperature hovering right at 70 degrees. He reached over and squeezed her hand. "Let's go find some glasses."
Rosemary knew she shouldn't allow herself to get too used to living in the lap of luxury like this, but she had to admit, there was a lot to be said for sipping Pinot Grigio on a gorgeous flagstone terrace while watching the westering sun dip slowly into the sparkling waters of the Pacific. After that glass of wine, she and Will ordered in Thai and sat down to eat it at the enormous table in the dining room, big enough to seat 20 people. Not quite big enough to accommodate all their guests, however, which was why they decided to have both the ceremony and the reception outside. Although they had a backup plan to move everything into the enormous living room and shift its furniture to the massive 6-bay garage if necessary, just in case the weather decided to be difficult. Still, it wasn't going to be a big wedding, just around 40 guests in all. Audrey and Isabel and Celeste, Rosemary's other sister, would be her attendants, while Will's brother Robert was going to be his best man, and Michael and Fred would round out the wedding party. The rest of the guests included family, like Will's parents and Rosemary's parents, along with an assortment of friends both new and old, including Penny Briggs and Isaac Zamora. They'd obviously been a little surprised at the way the wedding had come together so quickly, but promised to be there, even though they'd be flying back to New Mexico almost immediately afterward, so Penny wouldn't miss her first Christmas in Santa Fe. After they were done on the terrace, Rosemary and Will stowed their half-drunk bottle of Pinot Grigio in the huge panel front fridge in the kitchen, and switched over to a very light red blend to accompany their meal of Thai takeout. Glass in hand, she gestured toward the huge chandelier that hung over the gleaming oak table and asked, "Who do you think used to live here?" "I don't know," Will replied. I was able to look up a little of the home's history. It was built for a couple of silent movie stars, and yet I couldn't find out much more than that. The place changed hands several times in the 40s and 50s, but the records I found on Vista de los Robles didn't say much about who owned it later on. At least, not until the story picks up again in the 90s, when it was bought by the management company that owns it now so they could refurbish it and start using it as an event venue. I guess they rent it out for private corporate retreats and that kind of thing, in addition to all the weddings they've held here. Rosemary had never been one for the corporate world. She owned a metaphysical bookstore with her two sisters in Glendora's small vintage downtown district, but she thought getting to spend a weekend here might help a little to deal with cubicle life. In fact, she remembered seeing some verbiage about company retreats on the venue's website. However, since she'd been planning a wedding, she hadn't paid much attention to those particular details. "Has it changed a lot?" she asked, and Will shook his head. "Not from what I was able to tell. There aren't a lot of photos from the 1920s version of the place, but it looks like the grounds are about the same, with the pool and the fountain and everything else right where they are now. It sounds as if the current owners did their best to search out the furnishings in the local stores where they ended up and bring them back there. So I have a feeling the movie stars who built the place wouldn't find it too changed." She was glad to hear that. So much that was old and beautiful in Southern California got torn down on a regular basis to be replaced with buildings that were new and, to her eyes anyway, ugly. So it was refreshing to be in a place where the owners had done their very best to return the house to its original glory. Thank God Fred had found this place for them. As far as she could tell, it was absolutely perfect. She clinked her glass against Will's. "Here's to restoring history." He smiled, crystalline gray eyes looking somehow moody in the light from the dim chandelier overhead. "I'll drink to that." They both sipped their wine as they moved the conversation to the wedding, to all the moving parts that would start to come into play tomorrow, and the day afterward. Rosemary hadn't hired a wedding planner, mostly because her mother and her sister Isabel had both declared that they could handle everything. And so far it seemed as if those claims had been accurate, because they'd been able to source flowers and a band and table linens and all the rest, despite the seriously short time frame they were dealing with. Rosemary had a feeling a lot of this had been facilitated by Fred's outstanding ability to find exactly what you needed, no matter what it might be, thanks to his internet sleuthing abilities and an online network that seemed pretty much endless. But she wasn't going to inquire too closely. No, the important thing was that this wedding was going to go off without a hitch, and at the end of it, she'd be Will's wife. In the end, that was all that really mattered, right? Chapter 2. Rosemary's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment panic seized her. The room where she lay felt vast and dark, unfamiliar. But then she heard Will breathing next to her, and the irrational beating of her heart slowed a bit. True, he wasn't as close to her as he would have been at home, since there they only had a queen-sized bed, and this one was a California king, but still, he was lying only a foot and a half away, his mere presence reassuring her that everything was fine. They were in Santa Barbara, well, technically, Montecito, and in a few days they'd get married. Nothing to panic about. It wasn't her impending nuptials that had awoken her in a panic, though. Even now the dream was receding, the nightmare spinning back into the vortex from whence it came, and she couldn't remember anything of it except a sensation of foreboding, of dread. Too much wine and pad thai, probably. They'd been talking and laughing, and had finished the bottle, something they rarely did on a weeknight, especially after drinking a glass on the patio. But this felt like a vacation of sorts, a kind of pre-honeymoon. Not that the real thing was going to be all that special, just an extra day spent here in Santa Barbara, since neither of them wanted to be away from home at Christmas and would be returning to Pasadena on Tuesday. She lay in bed for a long moment, breathing in and out, and wondered if she should wander downstairs to get herself a glass of water. Her own damn fault for not bringing some water up here with her. But again, she'd been careless, only thinking about getting into bed with Will so they could make giddy, happy love before both basically passing out. The house was huge, so huge that she knew the home she shared with Will could have fit into it almost 10 times over. She didn't think it would be a very good idea to go blundering around in the dark in a place she didn't know at all, one where she thought she could quite easily get lost. True, she could flick on the lights as she went, but she also didn't want to wake up the man who slept so heavily next to her. Get some water from the bathroom, she told herself. It's a lot closer. Still more of a trek than she was used to, considering this bedroom and its enormous ensuite bath and matching walk-in closets were about the size of the house she'd sold in Glendora, but still, she'd have a much lower chance of getting lost here. That seemed to decide things. Moving carefully, she slid out from under the covers. The air in the room was cool against her bare skin, since she'd only pulled on her panties, and hadn't worried about trying to find one of the pretty, silky nightgowns and matching robes she'd packed for this trip. Ignoring the chill as best she could, she padded across the enormous Persian rug that covered most of the floor and headed into the bathroom. At least someone had left a nightlight in there, one tucked down low, almost behind the massive vanity that took up most of one wall. It wasn't so bright that it would disturb anyone sleeping in the main room, but it cast just enough light that she was able to make her way to the sink, where a cut glass tumbler waited on the counter next to the bag of toiletries she'd left there. Perfect. She turned on the tap and poured some water into the glass, doing her best to avoid looking at her reflection in the mirror that hung above the sink. It wasn't one of those huge sheet glass jobs that covered the whole wall, but rather a gilt-framed oval matching the one mounted to the wall a few feet over and above the other sink in the vanity. But still, she'd heard enough horror stories from Audrey about the sorts of things that could emerge from mirrors that it just seemed better to avert her gaze while she was standing here in the near dark. Just as she was setting down her glass, her thirst sated for now, she froze. Something had knocked against the exterior wall of the house. Just a possum, or maybe a raccoon, she told herself. Or maybe a woodpecker with insomnia. Then it knocked again, and she held her breath, even as she tried to determine exactly where the sound was coming from. Problem was, she couldn't really tell. The first knock seemed as though it had hit the wall outside, but the second one felt more as if it had come directly from the roof. A third knock, this one that sounded as if someone had rapped on the floor right below the spot where she stood. This time, she didn't worry about keeping quiet. No, she ran out of the bathroom and into the bedroom, and jumped onto the bed with enough force that Will was instantly awake, sitting bolt upright as he stared out into the darkness. "What's the matter?" he asked, even as he reached for her. Rosemary couldn't say for sure why she was so upset, but she didn't hesitate for even a second before she let him fold her into his arms. "I don't know," she said. Even as she spoke, a terrible little shiver shuddered its way down her spine. "I heard something." His lips were warm against her hair, already helping to calm the frightened beating of her heart. "What sort of thing?" "Knocks," he said. "On the wall, and then the ceiling, and then somewhere under the floor." Something about his body seemed to stiffen. "There were 3 knocks." "Yes," Rosemary replied. There was probably something significant about the number, but right then, she couldn't recall what it might be. She pulled away from him just a little, enough so she could see his face. Or rather, try to catch something of his expression, thanks to how dark it was in there. But because she'd already disentangled herself from him, he pulled away a little more so he could reach over and flick the switch on the bedside lamp. Now there was no mistaking the taut set to his mouth, the worry in his clear gray eyes as he glanced around the room. She did her best to follow his gaze, but she didn't see anything except the same massively beamed ceiling above, and the carved armoire directly opposite the bed that she'd already noted when they first came up here to drop off their luggage. Despite the heavy ceiling, the place was light and bright, with white oak floors and creamy white paint on the walls. "Will," she asked, "what are you thinking?" At once he turned back toward her. His mouth lifted slightly at the corners, but there was little humor in his expression. "It's probably nothing," he said slowly. "Just the plumbing acting up is my best guess. Even though it's been meticulously updated, this is still an old house." That seemed like a logical enough explanation to her. Well, except for the grim expression her fiancé wore. "But you were thinking it might be something else," she ventured, and his lips tightened. 3 knocks in the middle of the night is not usually something you want to brush off," he said, and paused so he could look over at the clock next to the bed. 5 minutes after 3, which meant she'd probably been awakened right at 3 a.m. or just a little before. Especially at this hour, he went on, his tone sounding heavier than ever. That's often a sign of demonic infestation. Although she'd pulled the covers up around her as she climbed back into bed, right then it felt as if she'd been dunked in a vat of ice water. "Eye infestation?" she responded, and immediately Will reached out for her and pulled her close to him again so he could wrap his arms around her. "That's obviously the worst-case scenario," he said. "Like I said, it's probably just some kind of plumbing thing. Did you feel anything strange when you came into the house earlier?" Now, with his arms around her, she was starting to feel a little better. Not all the way, but enough that she was able to push aside her recent fright and focus on her impressions of Vista de los Robles when they'd first arrived. As far as she could recall, she hadn't felt anything except a rush of admiration, peppered with a small dose of intimidation maybe, just because this place was so much grander than anywhere else she'd ever been. Not even the huge faux colonial mansion in Greencastle, Indiana, where the half-demon Daniel Lockwood had lived, could compare to this gracious villa, built back in the day when movies didn't have sound, and everyone thought the current golden age would go on forever. "Nothing," she told Will. Not even a twinge. All right, she wasn't a true demon hunter like Michael Covenant. She was psychic, sure, but that wasn't the same thing as having the sorts of gifts required to face down the forces of darkness. Maybe that wasn't entirely true, because she'd joined her powers with her sisters and her mother, and her long-lost angel father to send Belial back to hell, but still, she couldn't call herself an expert on the subject of demon infestations. Not by a long stretch. Especially because everything had gone quiet since then, until Penny Briggs and Isaac Zamora had reached out to Michael for help just a little over a month ago, and Rosemary and Will had discovered that Belial wasn't quite as banished as they'd all hoped. But he really was gone now, completely annihilated and not merely driven from this world, which meant she should have been able to go back to her bookstore and her quiet life and not have to worry about demons anymore. Will was silent for a moment. "It could be nothing," he said. "In the meantime, though, I'll make sure we're safe here." A gentle kiss pressed against her forehead, and then he climbed out of bed and went over to the armoire. She almost blurted, "Don't open it," but realized that was foolish. This wasn't a horror movie, nothing was lurking in the oversized wardrobe. Which proved to be the case, as he opened the doors to reveal absolutely nothing inside except a black satchel resting on the bottom. He reached inside and pulled out a little plastic vial. "Holy water," he said, even though she'd already recognized the innocuous-looking bottle, the sort of thing you'd usually fill with shampoo or cleanser to comply with airline regulations on liquids in carry-ons. "Don't leave home without it," she quipped, and he smiled at her, a real grin this time and not a faint lift of his mouth that wouldn't have fooled anyone. But then he was all business, sprinkling holy water in the various corners of the room, dabbing it on the doorframe, going into the bathroom, and most likely touching all the corners and pertinent spots there as well, although Rosemary couldn't see everything of what he was doing. He came back to the bed soon enough, and set the half-empty bottle of holy water on the side table, before sliding under the covers next to her. "That should do it for now," he said. "I doubt anything will disturb us for the rest of the night." She wanted to believe that. However, she'd seen for herself that holy water only really worked on true demons, not half-demons like Daniel Lockwood or quarter demons like his son Caleb. But she definitely didn't want to think about Caleb, about the way he'd tried to trick her into believing she'd been part demon like him, instead of the half-angel she actually was. His interest in her had been, well, unholy. He'd been banished to hell with the rest of the Greencastle gang, though, so she knew he couldn't be the one who'd been lurking by their bathroom and making odd taps on the wall and ceiling and floor. If it really was anything other than plumbing issues, which she wanted to believe but didn't know whether she truly could. Will seemed confident that the holy water would protect them, though, so she decided it was better not to argue. Instead, she snuggled close, and he dropped his arm around her, heavy, comforting. With him there, she thought she might be able to sleep. Assuming there were no more strange noises, of course. But even as that thought passed through her mind, her eyes closed, and soon enough, the world around her faded, and she fell into slumber.
Chapter 3. The disturbances of the night before must have affected Rosemary more than he'd thought, because she didn't even stir, as Will carefully slipped his arm from under her and then got out of bed. He had a vague recollection of pulling the drapes shut. What the hell had possessed them to drink so much? But the heavy ecru damask couldn't quite conceal the brightness of the day outside. His mouth was dry, so, like Rosemary the night before, he went back into the bathroom to pour himself a glass of water. A glance around the space told him that nothing seemed to have been disturbed. No bloody handprints on the walls, no objects moved around, no strange smells or sounds. No, it looked like a perfectly normal bathroom, or at least, a perfectly normal bath in a high-end luxury retreat. He splashed some cold water on his face, drank some more from the tumbler he'd poured for himself, then headed into the water closet to take care of business. By the time he was done and had come back out into the bedroom, Rosemary was awake and sitting up in bed, her gaze seeming to take in every detail of the space around her. "Everything looks fine," she said. Was that a note of disappointment in her voice? While that kind of reaction might have seemed odd to some people, Will thought he understood. If evil spirits really were lurking somewhere in this house, better to get them out in the open so they could be dealt with rather than have them hiding someplace where it would be more difficult to track them down. "Yes," he replied, and came over to the bed so he could lean down and press a gentle kiss against her lips. Same thing for the bathroom. If there really was something here, it seems the holy water convinced it to take its games elsewhere. He kept his tone light on purpose. The last thing he wanted was for his fiancée to be so worried about the possibility of ghosts or demons here at Vista de los Robles that she wouldn't allow herself to enjoy these days they'd set aside for themselves in Santa Barbara. It seemed his words had some effect, because the troubled furrow to her brow disappeared and she even smiled. "Sure looks that way. So let's go downstairs and get some breakfast."
They'd already decided to eat here in the morning, mostly because they were expecting Audrey and Michael to arrive sometime midday, and the group had agreed to go out for a late lunch afterward. That was why Rosemary and Will had brought some groceries along, and they now stood at the oven together, with him minding the pan of fried potatoes and onions while she kept an eye on the scrambled eggs. Nothing down here felt at all strange to her. Honestly, the whole incident the night before seemed like something out of a dream, and if it weren't that Will remembered her talking about the sounds she'd heard, and how he'd gone around the space afterward sprinkling holy water everywhere, she might have dismissed it as a nightmare born from stress about the wedding. After all, what better way to screw up the ceremony and the reception than to have the site of your nuptials infested with demons? It all seemed quiet enough this morning, and honestly, with some of the windows open to let in a fresh breeze that smelled vaguely of sea salt, and the bright sun slanting into the house, she found it hard to believe that demons were even real. She knew better, though. The kitchen had a nook at one end that overlooked the rear gardens, so they took their food and coffee over there to enjoy the greenery, even if there weren't many flowers blooming at this time of year except the roses. "Maybe I imagined the whole thing," she said, and Will paused with a bite of home fries halfway to his mouth. "I don't know about that. You seemed convinced that you heard something, and you're not the kind of person to imagine things that aren't there." She supposed that was true enough. While she'd gone through a hell of a lot, pardon the expression, a few years earlier while dealing with Caleb and the rest of the Greencastle demons, she'd never once manufactured any of the frightening incidents that had happened to her. What would have been the point in inventing those things, considering real life was scary enough? About all she could do was shrug. "We'll have Michael and Audrey check into it when they get here," Will continued. "But I also think it might be a good idea to contact the property manager to see if anyone else has mentioned odd noises coming from the main suite bathroom." Rosemary wasn't so sure if she liked that idea. Because they were getting such a killer deal on the place, she didn't want to do anything to rock the boat. However, she knew if she mentioned that particular concern, Will would point out, justly so, that they were still paying customers, and it wasn't as if they'd bargained the property management company down to get a better price. They should still have a good experience here, even if they weren't paying the going rate. Well, let's wait and see what Michael and Audrey have to say, she replied. They'll be here in a few hours anyway, and things seem absolutely peaceful this morning. It could all turn out to be nothing. A flicker passed across Will's face, but Rosemary couldn't quite figure out exactly what it meant. She'd gotten very good at reading him over the past couple of years, and yet there were still times when his emotions were ever so slightly opaque. Maybe he was only doing his best to hide his concerns so she wouldn't get overly rattled right before the ceremony. But then he smiled at her and said, "That sounds like a good plan to me," and seemed content to leave it there. And really, the rest of the morning was a study in ordinariness. They had a good deal of fun in the oversized shower. How could they not when that glass-enclosed space and its smooth marble walls practically beckoned them to come in and play? And afterward, they walked the grounds and took a few measurements just to be on the safe side. As far as Rosemary could tell, her mother and Izzy had done a great job of figuring out the diagrams for table placement and where the dance floor would be set up, but she still figured it couldn't hurt to double-check everything to avoid any surprises on the day of the big event. "This place really is amazing," she said after she and Will had headed back into the house to get some iced tea, before returning to the terrace so they could sit down there and gaze at the ocean while they sipped their drinks. "I wonder what it would have been like to live here." Unlike her, he hadn't bothered with sunglasses, and amused crinkles appeared around his eyes, which looked more crystalline than ever in the bright late morning sun. "Worried that our house is going to feel too cramped after we get home?" "Hardly," she said, her tone mock severe, and then she grinned. "Can you imagine having to clean all these bathrooms?" Since Vista de los Robles had 12 in all, that would have been a task to daunt even the most dedicated housekeeper. Will must have been thinking the same thing, because he returned her grin saying, "Not really. They must have had a huge cleaning staff here back in the day." "Probably, along with a cook and a driver and a butler and Lord knows what else." Rosemary remembered the large cast of the downstairs crew in Downtown Abbey, and figured whoever had lived here once upon a time must have had a similar staff to keep things going. "Simpler is better for me," she said before adding, "although I'm not going to lie, I'm looking forward to getting that addition going at our place so we can have more than one bathroom." Since Will agreed with her on that point, she knew he wouldn't argue. Otherwise, he would never have gone along with the remodel in the first place. They wouldn't get started until late spring though, since they'd figured it would be better to wait until the rainy season had passed before they tore off one wall of the house. And then she spied the sun glinting off a windshield, as a car began to wind its way up the long drive that led to the house. "Looks like Audrey and Michael are here." Will glanced that way as well and nodded. "Then let's go and meet them."
At first, it was all hugs and hellos. Will and Rosemary hadn't seen their friends since Thanksgiving, since Audrey was still in the thick of her doctoral work, although it sounded as though she'd be done in late May, and the couple would finally be back in Southern California after their extended hiatus in Tucson, where she was getting her PhD from the University of Arizona. But then Michael paused, his keen gray eyes flecked with gold, taking in their surroundings, from the polished oak floors to the huge Christmas tree that stood in one corner of the living room, classy and understated with ornaments all in pearl white and shades of gold and silver. "This is quite a place you found," he said. "There's something about it, though." "You feel something?" Rosemary said eagerly, and Audrey and Michael exchanged a weighted glance. "Maybe," Michael replied. "The important question, though, is, do you? You're the ones who've already spent a night here." Will looked over at Rosemary, who gave a small hitch of her shoulders, as if she wanted to let him know she was just fine with letting him explain the situation. "We're not sure," he said. Rosemary woke up, in the middle of the night, and went into the bathroom to get a drink of water. When she was in there, she heard 3 distinct knocks, one on the exterior wall, one on the ceiling, and one coming from somewhere under the floor. At once, Michael's brows drew together, and Audrey gave an anxious glance up at the arched ceiling above them, as though she halfway expected demonic figures to emerge from the heavy plaster and go on the attack. But everything remained as quiet as it had been all morning, again forcing Will to wonder if they were getting worked up about some noisy plumbing and nothing more. If it was just the plumbing, though, would Michael have immediately picked up on a vibe that wasn't quite right? 3 knocks isn't good, he said, and Will gave a reluctant nod. I know that, he said. I sprinkled holy water all around the main suite, and things were quiet afterward. Audrey looked up again, although this time he got the impression she was doing her best to let her own psychic senses get the flavor of their surroundings. But then she shook her head, pretty features a picture of frustration. I'm not feeling anything, she said, and Michael reached out and touched her hand. It's very subtle, he told her. Honestly, I probably would have dismissed what I was sensing if Will hadn't just told us about the noises Rosemary heard last night. We should probably investigate the space. Nothing happened after that, Rosemary said, although her cheeks had just turned faintly pink. Most likely, she was remembering what the two of them had done in the shower only a few hours earlier. However, they hadn't left any trace of their lovemaking, and had placed all their discarded underwear in the canvas bags they'd brought along for laundry, so it wasn't as if it had been strewn all over the floor. In fact, they'd been careful to clean up thoroughly after they were done in the bathroom, making sure the counters had been wiped clean of any bristles from his morning shaving session or any traces from their toothbrushing. It should probably be safe enough to have Michael and Audrey go up there. Well, Will said, we need to get your luggage up to your room anyway, so we'll do that first, and then head over to the main suite to see if you can sense anything there. Everyone seemed agreeable to this plan, so Audrey and Michael picked up several bags, and Rosemary and Will took the rest, making the division of labor a little more equal. The new arrivals didn't have quite as much to carry, since, while Audrey was in the wedding party, she still wasn't toting around a wedding gown and veil. Or at least Will thought Rosemary might have a veil tucked in with her dress, although she'd been very secretive about the whole thing and hadn't given him any details, saying she wanted it all to be a surprise. Most of the time, he wasn't a huge fan of surprises, but in this particular instance, he was very much looking forward to seeing what she'd chosen to wear for their wedding. The bedroom Rosemary had picked out for Michael and Audrey was located at the far end of the upstairs hall, and offered views of both the ocean and the property's park-like grounds. Once in there, the couple made approving comments about the size of the room and its furnishings, but they also merely set their bags on the floor rather than putting them in the walk-in closet, as though they didn't want to waste any more time here than necessary. Let's see about that bathroom, Michael said. This way, Rosemary replied. It's at the other end of the hallway. The 4 of them all headed over to the main suite. By that point, the hour was inching past 1, and they probably should have been discussing where they wanted to go for lunch, but Will could tell his old friend wasn't about to get distracted by trivialities like food until they'd gotten to the bottom of the strange knocks Rosemary had heard the night before. As soon as they entered the bathroom, Michael frowned. It feels stronger in here. Audrey reached out to touch the marble countertop, then nodded. You're right, she said. It's sort of a strange, thundery feeling. A demon? Rosemary asked. She looked pale, and Will reached out to take her hand. For a few seconds, neither of their friends replied. Then Michael said, forehead still puckered with concern, I can't say for sure. Sometimes it's hard to tell whether something is a demon or merely a negative spirit until they begin to act out in some way. What you heard last night could have been a ghost trying to imitate demonic behavior, Audrey put in. It's rare, but we've come across cases like that, mostly when the spirit is really invested in trying to get rid of anyone they think is invading their territory. Rosemary's fingers tightened on Will's, and he said, trying to sound unconcerned, well, they're not getting rid of us. It would be almost impossible to move the wedding at such late notice. Understood, Michael said easily. But one easy way to tell what we're dealing with here is for me to get my EMF meter. If it's just a ghost, it should show up. If it's a demon, well, we shouldn't be able to get any kind of a reading. Trust Michael to bring one of his ghost-hunting gizmos along to a wedding. As far as Will knew, though, his friend would never allow himself to travel without some of the tools of the trade. Especially when he knew the site of his friend's wedding was a house more than a century old. A home of that vintage could make it through all those years without collecting a ghost along the way, but it was kind of rare. Audrey appeared relieved by that suggestion. Yes, that should clear things up pretty quickly. Is it in your overnight bag? She seemed almost eager to go and fetch the device. Was there something particularly oppressive about the atmosphere in the bathroom? But Michael said, "It is, but it's pretty buried. I should go get it. Just hang out here for a minute." Before anyone could reply, he hurried out of the room, leaving the remaining trio to glance awkwardly around the space. "If it's a ghost, it should be easy to get rid of, right?" Rosemary asked. Yes, she'd had her own experiences with an earthbound spirit, the ghost who once had been engaged to Michael's former business partner Colin Turner. But Madeline Nash had disappeared of her own volition once the information she was trying to impart had been delivered. Whatever was lingering here, at Vista de los Robles, might be a little more difficult to deal with. "Probably," Audrey replied, although her troubled expression seemed to indicate that inwardly she wasn't as sure of a happy outcome, even if she didn't want to voice her doubts aloud to a woman who was planning to get married here 2 days from now. It really depends on what's keeping it connected to this particular spot. In these cases, the trick is discovering what happened to make a spirit earthbound, and what we need to do to ensure they move on. To heaven, or wherever it was that spirits went after leaving this plane. Will knew that heaven existed. How could he not when his faith had been strong even before he fell in love with a woman whose father just happened to be an angel kicked out of the heavenly realm for using his powers to protect his family? But he also had the impression that heaven might be the final destination, and that there were possibly many more planes where people needed to live other lives and learn other lessons before they went to their final reward, so to speak. Rosemary nodded, and Michael reappeared then, EMF meter in one hand. He must have turned it on as he was walking back to the main suite, since the lights on the little gadget were already active. "I wanted to see if it detected something in the hallway," he explained to the waiting group. "But I didn't pick up anything except the usual interference from background electronic activity. You know, the wiring in the walls, the signals from our cell phones. So let's see what it does in here." He stepped toward the vanity with its pair of gilt-edged, oversized mirrors. The whole time they'd been congregated in the bathroom, Will had noticed the way Rosemary had averted her eyes from those mirrors, as if she expected something sinister to be peering back at her. Then again, thanks to what they knew of Audrey's negative experiences with reflective surfaces, he supposed his fiancée was wise to be cautious. When getting ready earlier, Rosemary had put on her makeup at the vanity table out in the bedroom, rather than here in the bathroom. She'd claimed it was because she thought the lighting was better there, but he guessed she had other reasons than that. But then Michael shook his head, saying, "I'm not getting anything in here either. That doesn't necessarily have to mean much. The spirit may be haunting the entire house, and therefore could be almost anywhere, but it could also mean that it's not a ghost at all." Rosemary spoke then, her tone as worried as her expression. "So, you think it really is a demon?" "I'm not sure it's anything at all," Michael said frankly. "Sometimes, the simplest explanation is the right one. You really should talk to the property manager and find out whether this property has a history of noisy plumbing. It can happen in these old houses when they're not updated properly." That was the explanation Will had been hoping for all along. But there was only one way to be sure. "Okay," he said. "Rosemary and I will reach out to the management company. And Audrey and I will take the EMF meter and go over the rest of the house," Michael responded. "We might still turn up something." While Will would rather the issue be the plumbing and not a ghost, having a spirit here was still infinitely preferable to discovering the place was infested by a demon. Only one way to find out, though. "Sounds like a plan," he said. "You can meet us in the kitchen when you're done." Michael tilted his head in acknowledgement, and he and Audrey headed back out to the upstairs corridor, clearly intent on exploring all the rooms on this floor. Will glanced back at Rosemary, whose delicate features were still a study in worry. "Come on, sweetheart," he said, and pressed a kiss against her cheek. "Let's see what the management company has to say."
Chapter 4. Their contact person at the management company was a woman named Priscilla St. John. Rosemary thought someone with a name like that sounded as if she should own Vista de los Robles, instead of merely managing it. And the woman herself didn't do much to contradict that sort of impression, since she was tall, icily blonde, and somewhere between 50 and 60, with impeccably understated clothing and the sort of quietly expensive jewelry that didn't see the need to shout about how much it had cost. But thank God Will was the one making the call. It wasn't as if Rosemary had phone anxiety, not exactly, but every time she'd spoken with Priscilla St. John, she'd felt scrubby and underdressed, some kind of upstart who was trying to be bougie but had no idea what true class and style were. Well, she definitely wasn't a lady who lunched, and her sequin-spangled skirts and ballet flats certainly fit much better in the metaphysical bookstore she owned with her sisters than they would, having tea at the Ritz-Carlton, but that didn't mean her money wasn't as good as anyone else's. Whereas Priscilla seemed almost impressed by Will, although Rosemary couldn't say for sure whether that was because he was an Episcopal priest or just because he was so damn good-looking. The two of them stood at the massive island in the kitchen, with Will's phone on the expensive dolomite counter. He'd put it on speaker so she could hear everything, but it seemed clear he understood she would much prefer that he took the lead in the conversation. "No," Priscilla said in answer to his question, "I've never had a single person complain about the plumbing in the house. Everything was updated about 5 years ago, and we have our maintenance team go out once a month to check all the systems and make sure everything is operating properly." She paused there, then added, "But if you'd like someone to come to the house and take a look, we can certainly accommodate that request." Will flicked a glance at Rosemary, and she gave an uncertain shrug. It would be silly to have someone come all the way out here to inspect the plumbing, if it turned out their problem was entirely supernatural in nature. But then Michael and Audrey entered the kitchen, and he sent them a brief shake of the head in response to Will and Rosemary's questioning looks. So much for the ghost theory. Will seemed to understand that line of investigation was finished because he told Priscilla, "That would probably be a good idea. I'm sure it's nothing, but better to get it cleared up before the ceremony." "Of course," she said smoothly. "I can have someone out there late this afternoon, if that's all right. He's busy at one of our other properties at the moment." "Late afternoon is fine," Will replied at once. "And we really appreciate the help." "It's nothing. Just part of the service. Our technician's name is Gustavo Lopez. He should be there sometime between 4 and 5. "Thanks so much," Will said, and Priscilla murmured a brief "you're welcome" before ending the call. He picked up his phone and put it back in his pocket. "So now what?" "Now," Rosemary said firmly, "we go to lunch and get the heck out of this house for a couple of hours."
As beautiful as Vista de los Robles was, Will couldn't quite ignore the way his spirits lifted once they were all away from the place. They decided to park in one of the garages down near State Street, and then wander until they came to a place that looked good, which was how they'd ended up at the pretty little Mexican restaurant where they now sat. The wind off the ocean was just chilly enough that they decided to eat inside, but that was fine, since they were given a nice booth in a back room where they could speak freely. Not, of course, until they'd put in their orders for margaritas and some chips with a salsa sampler. By that point, it was nearly 2 o'clock, and Will knew the chips wouldn't put even a dent in his appetite, despite the decent-sized breakfast he and Rosemary had shared. "What do you think, Michael?" she said, after taking a sip of her mango margarita. He was in the middle of reaching for a chip when she asked the question, and he dunked it in some pico de gallo before replying. "I'm not sure what to think yet," he told her. The EMF meter didn't pick up anything strange, and while ghosts can be elusive in other ways, they usually can't hide their energy signatures. So at this point, I think the best thing to do is wait to see what the plumber has to say before we jump to any conclusions. Although Rosemary didn't appear too reassured by that response, she seemed to realize there wasn't much reason to indulge in idle speculation until they could rule out a physical cause for the odd sounds she'd heard the night before. She sipped some more of her margarita, but only nodded in reply. "Did either of you notice anything else odd about the place while you were there?" Audrey asked then. "Any feelings of oppression, weird smells?" Both Will and Rosemary shook their heads. Nothing at all, he said. I suppose that's the strange part. I won't pretend to be anywhere near as psychic as the rest of you, but in the past, when I've helped Michael with some of his investigations, even I could feel something wrong when I entered a house where there was a case of infestation or possession. Audrey looked over at Michael, whose shoulders lifted before he reached for another chip. I didn't feel much of anything either, he said. Maybe the slightest sensation of being off, but that's about it. Nothing like my previous investigations, when there was definitely a demon present. And the knocks were the only odd phenomena, correct? Yes, Rosemary replied. When we got up this morning, everything seemed totally normal. Nothing bothered us in the shower or when we were getting breakfast ready. So maybe it really was all in my head. Her tone was light, but Will could tell she was doing her best to sound normal because she didn't know what to think. However, while both Michael and Audrey appeared somewhat puzzled, they also didn't seem to believe that his fiancée had made the whole thing up. I highly doubt that, Michael said. No, you experienced something. He paused there, and his expression grew almost contemplative. Did the two of you do anything that felt out of character after you got to the house? Will wasn't sure what his friend was driving at with that question. Out of character, how? I don't know for sure, Michael responded. You would know that better than me. Now, Rosemary appeared even more troubled. We drank a lot more than we usually would, she said. Although some pink touched her cheeks, she met their friend's gaze squarely as she went on. That is, we had some wine on the patio and drank about half the bottle, but a little later, after we'd ordered some takeout, we drank all of the bottle we'd opened for dinner. We're almost always a one glass with dinner kind of couple, so that was sort of strange. When she put it that way, Will realized their behavior had been a little odd. At the time, he'd thought they were only relaxing into their new surroundings and maybe celebrating the start of their pre-honeymoon. Now, though, he had to wonder if something else might have been going on. Michael didn't appear judgmental at all, only thoughtful. I've seen incidences like this. The demon exerts a subtle influence on a person to do something out of character, and they don't even realize what's going on at first. It's not until later that a pattern begins to emerge, and they see the demon was doing its best to put them in a vulnerable position. Like being drunk. All right, Will didn't think he and Rosemary had been drunk, but they'd been pretty tipsy, laughing at silly things, practically tearing each other's clothes off when they got to the bedroom. No, it wasn't as if their passion had died down over the past 2 years. If anything, it had grown stronger, but they also generally didn't act like a couple of high school kids rushing to do the deed before someone's parents got home from work. Rosemary stared at Michael. That's messed up. It is, he agreed as he reached for a chip. But demons in general are messed up. The good thing is that you can ward against that sort of influence if you know what to look out for. Not that we know whether a demon is even involved here, Audrey put in. She'd ordered a classic margarita, and she swirled her straw through the thick, icy concoction without taking a sip. The two of you could have just been letting off some steam. After all, it's been a crazy busy couple of weeks for you, right? Will couldn't argue with that assertion. Not when it seemed as though the time after they'd booked Vista de los Robles had been an utter whirlwind of agreeing on one detail about the ceremony or the reception after another. True, Glynis and Isabel, Rosemary's mother and sister, had done a lot of the heavy lifting, but he'd still had to agree on chocolate for the groom's cake, and spice with cream cheese filling for the main wedding cake, and to sign off on having a seafood option for dinner as well as beef and vegetarian. It's definitely been busy, Rosemary agreed. But if we'd really been that exhausted, we should have had just a glass of wine for dinner and collapsed afterward rather than getting tipsy like a couple of kids who just raided their parents' liquor cabinet or something. For a moment, neither Audrey nor Michael replied. They sent another of those significant glances at each other, as though inwardly agreeing on how they should respond to Rosemary's comment. Maybe, Michael allowed. Right now, I think it's probably a good idea not to make snap judgments about anything. Let's see what the plumber has to say, and we can go from there. Will was definitely on board with that idea. Their waiter came by with their food, so all discussions of possible demon infestation were tabled until he was gone, and they had a chance to put something a little more solid in their stomachs than just chips and salsa. With any luck, it would turn out that this was all speculation, and they could go on with the wedding without worrying about this odd little blip.
As much as Rosemary would have liked to hover while Gustavo went about his work, she knew it wouldn't help at all to be in the plumber's way as he poked around in the bathroom. Instead, she and Will and Audrey and Michael waited downstairs in the family room, a large space only slightly less grand than the formal living room, where a huge 80-inch TV hung on the wall and the leather furniture was just worn enough to be extra comfortable. The house also had an honest-to-God theater down on the lower level, complete with reclining seats, better than anything she'd ever experienced at the local theaters in Pasadena. But she supposed a house this size needed to have multiple places for people to entertain themselves. The day was sufficiently cool that they only had one window open in the family room, but it still let in enough of the salty air to remind Rosemary that she was a long way from the inland valley she called home. But that was the fun part. She could have a destination wedding without forcing people to fly halfway around the world, instead requiring a drive of only a few hours. Well, except for Will's parents, who still lived in Brookline, Massachusetts. They'd be flying in tomorrow, although his brother and sister, who both had young children, wouldn't be able to make it. Everything had been too last minute for them to make the necessary arrangements, especially this close to the holidays. There would be other times to get together though, and Rosemary had to privately admit to herself that it was probably better not to have a bunch of kids 6 and under running around the place. As her only nephew, Tyler would be included, of course, and if Will's nieces and nephews had been attending, after all, she would have done everything in her power to accommodate them. But since they wouldn't be here, she would allow herself an inner sigh of relief, and know she wouldn't have to worry about any of the internet horror stories she'd read about toddlers sticking their hands in the cake before it had even been cut or spilling punch all over the bride's gown. Because none of them knew when Gustavo might appear, she and Will and Michael and Audrey kept their conversation purposely light, discussing elements of the ceremony and the reception. "This is just the quiet before the storm," Rosemary remarked as she picked up her glass of iced tea. She'd made another batch this morning in anticipation of her friend's arrival, and was glad of the chance to wind down from the margarita she'd had at lunch. It had been tasty, but more powerful than she'd expected. "As soon as Izzy and my mother and the rest of the gang arrive tomorrow, everything's going to kick into high gear." "Do you need us to help with anything?" Audrey asked, and immediately Rosemary shook her head. "No, we've got it covered. We have a big crew arriving Saturday morning to set everything up, and even though this all seems elaborate, it's not as huge a project as it looks from the outside. There'll only be 40 guests after all." Michael and Audrey exchanged an amused glance. "Only 40, Audrey said with a grin. Okay, compared to their courthouse wedding, it probably seemed like a lot. Neither of them had much family, and so they decided it would be easier to get married in Tucson and have Audrey's aunt, the only close relative she had, fly in from California for the big day. Will and Rosemary had driven to Arizona, and after the ceremony downtown, they'd gone up to the Catalina foothills and had an amazing dinner at a restaurant called Vivace, which boasted both some wonderful gourmet Italian food along with absolutely breathtaking views of the city lights. But as fun and low-key as it had been, their wedding didn't really compare with what she and Will had planned for their own nuptials. "That's nothing," Will commented, a smile of his own touching the corners of his mouth. "I've presided at weddings with 200 guests and more." Luckily, Rosemary and I both agreed we wanted to keep things a lot simpler than that. Yes, it all should have gone smoothly, if it weren't for the possibility of uninvited, demonic guests hanging around somewhere on the property. Right then, Gustavo appeared at the entrance to the family room. He looked as if he might be in his late 40s or early 50s, since his black hair was dusted with gray, and he had deep laugh lines around his brown eyes. However, he didn't appear all that cheerful now. "I looked everywhere," he said. "Tested the lines, made sure all the connections I could reach were tight, and that nothing could knock against the walls. Far as I can tell, there's nothing in that bathroom that could have made the sounds you heard." As he was speaking, Will had risen from his seat on the couch, and Rosemary followed suit. "You're sure?" she asked, doing her best to keep the disappointment from her voice. "As sure as I can be without opening up the walls," he replied. "Priscilla didn't give me permission to do that." No, Rosemary supposed she probably hadn't. It was one thing to start tearing up drywall if you had an active leak that needed to be repaired, and something else entirely to cause that kind of destruction just because one of your guests heard a strange sound. "It's fine," Will said, although something in his tone seemed to signal he wasn't sure anything about this was fine. "We wouldn't expect you to do something like that." Gustavo nodded. He wasn't a tall man, maybe around 5'8" on a good day, and Will positively towered over him. But he sounded friendly enough as he went on. "If you hear anything else though, just give Priscilla another call and we'll try to get it figured out." "We will," Rosemary told him. "Thank you so much for coming over to take a look." "Just doing my job." She and Will walked the plumber to the front door, thanked him again, and said goodbye. Afterward, Will closed the door, and the two of them headed back to the family room. "So much for that," Rosemary said. "Now what?" To her surprise, Michael didn't look terribly disappointed. In fact, his unusual gray-gold eyes appeared lively with interest. "Now," he said, "we find out what's really hiding in Vista de los Robles."
Chapter 5. Will honestly didn't know what Michael might have up his sleeve. Since all the times he'd been called in to help with possessions and infestations, the demons involved had been far less cagey and had made their presence well known. The answer was simpler and more dangerous than he'd imagined. "I thought we weren't supposed to mess around with these things," Rosemary said, tone and expression equally dubious, as she gazed down at the Ouija board he'd set on the game table in one corner of the family room. Only Michael Covenant would have thought it was a good idea to bring one of those sketchy tools of divination to a wedding. Will had to wonder what other arcane items he might have tucked away in the cargo space of Audrey's Ravi 4. "In general, you're not," Michael replied. They had all taken their places around the table, with Audrey to his right, and Rosemary to his left, and Will directly across from him. The problem arises when amateurs start playing around with forces they don't understand. He paused there, a thin smile lifting his lips. "But I know exactly what we're dealing with, and I know how to make sure things don't get out of hand." Will wasn't sure how his friend could know what they were dealing with when the demon involved, if there was even a demon at all, still hadn't deigned to show itself. But Michael certainly had plenty of experience working with the demonic. So even if he didn't know the identity of the demon that apparently had taken up residence in Vista de los Robles, he understood the precautions he needed to take. In this case, there was plenty of holy water stored nearby, along with a heavy silver crucifix that hung around his neck. Audrey wore a similar cross, and although Will had never been much for jewelry, he also had a cross hanging at his throat, a piece that was almost always hidden by his clothing. Of them all, Rosemary was the only one without that sacred symbol of protection, mainly because she hadn't been raised Christian, and as she'd told him on several occasions, she had no intention of switching her religion just because she was marrying an Episcopal priest. Not that he would have ever asked her to change a single thing about herself. As far as he was concerned, she was perfect just the way she was. Besides, her half-angelic nature provided its own set of protections, even though it couldn't be counted on to repel all demonic attacks. Her lips parted now, as if she'd intended to offer some sort of reply to Michael's comment. However, she closed her mouth almost at once, apparently deciding she'd rather sit tight for now and wait to see what happened. Audrey also remained silent, although Will couldn't say for sure whether that was because she trusted her husband implicitly or whether she'd also told herself it was better to see this through without offering any protest that might shake his confidence. At that thought, he had to repress a smile. Michael Covenant might freely admit that he had made mistakes from time to time, but he still remained one of the most confident people Will had ever met. Besides, less than a month earlier, they'd all helped Penny Briggs and Isaac Zamora face down a literal lord of hell. How hard could one little demon be? "All right then," Michael said. He shut his eyes for a moment, probably to make sure he was calm and centered and ready for whatever confrontation might be coming. A few words murmured under his breath, most likely the simple invocation of some sort of protection spell. And then he added, "Everyone, place your hands on the planchette." Both Audrey and Will immediately laid their fingers on the roughly teardrop-shaped piece of plastic, although Rosemary hesitated for a moment, clearly still not sure about this scheme. But then she released a breath and went ahead and placed her fingers next to his, giving him a quick sideways glance at the same time. He offered what he hoped was a reassuring smile in return, even as he knew he needed to stay quiet so as not to disrupt the vibrations in the space. "Is someone listening?" Michael asked then. The planchette trembled for a second under everyone's fingers, but it didn't move any more than that. Will hadn't used a Ouija board enough to know if that was due to their own energy touching the little piece of plastic, or whether the entity or entities lurking in Vista de los Robles were trying very hard not to betray their presence. Whatever was going on, Michael didn't appear too disturbed by it. No, his expression was almost blank, as if he wanted to make sure all his focus was turned inward rather than revealing anything in his expression. "If you're there, we ask that you please tell us." This time, the planchette moved slowly over to the yes. Something was grudging about the movement, as if it had done so only because it knew Michael would keep asking if it didn't reply. "Did you once live in this house?" Immediately, the plastic triangle moved over to no, and Michael gave the faintest of nods, as though the response seemed to confirm something he'd already been thinking. Well, if they really were speaking to a demon, it had never been alive in the true sense of the word. Both devils and angels existed outside this plane, and although they could come here and interact with humans, sometimes on intimate levels, as the offspring of Belial's demons and Rosemary's father proved, they were an utterly different order of being. "What is your name?" The planchette went still. Will didn't quite hold his breath, but he could tell that everyone else around the table was doing their best to remain as silent and unmoving as possible, so they wouldn't interfere with whatever message the entity was trying to convey. Then it zigged down to the H and over to the A, before pausing again. He hadn't made any in-depth studies of demons and their names, but Will still found himself racking his brains, doing his best to recall whether any of the ones he'd come across had a name that started with Haw. As he was pondering, the planchette moved again, this time going back to the H, and then the A again. After that, it skidded again to the H, traveling so quickly that everyone's fingers slipped off. After spelling out ha 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 ha, the planchette went flying across the room, hitting the wall hard enough that it fractured into several pieces before falling to the floor. For a moment, they all sat there in stunned silence before Michael gave the others a grim smile. "Well," he said, "it seems our resident demon has a sense of humor."
No one seemed too interested in staying in the house after the incident with the Ouija board, so they all went back out to the terrace. Earlier in the afternoon, a few clouds had drifted in, but by now they had disappeared, and the skies were clear and blue, the sun warm even though the breeze off the ocean was brisk enough. "So now what?" Rosemary asked. She knew she shouldn't be discouraged after one failure. Working with demons required large stores of patience, but still, it wasn't as if they had unlimited amounts of time to handle the problem. Hers and Will's family would be here tomorrow, and the ceremony would take place the day after that. How were they supposed to handle all those guests when they had absolutely no idea when the demon might get a wild hair about something and decide to wreak havoc? Michael, on the other hand, didn't appear too concerned. Demons never cooperate right off the bat, so this one's responses aren't anything to worry about. In fact, I get the impression that it's not all that powerful. Will stood at Rosemary's side, his hand holding hers, even as he had his head half turned away so he could look at the sparkling waters of the Pacific just beyond Santa Barbara's downtown. "What makes you say that?" he asked, returning his focus to Michael and the two women who stood nearby. A shrug. If we were dealing with a really strong demon, it might not have answered at all, thinking that kind of communication beneath it. But this one almost seemed compelled to answer, even if it managed to slip away without giving us the truth. He stopped there, and now his expression grew much more serious. Even a weak demon can cause a lot of damage, though. We can't let our guards down. And that was a hell of a way, pardon the expression, to celebrate her union to the man she loved, Rosemary thought. How in the world could she possibly enjoy a single second of their wedding, when she had no idea what might happen next? Audrey must have seen the shift in her friend's face because she said quickly, "It's not as bad as you think. What we need to do next is start setting up some wards and doing our best to hold the demon at bay. Even if we can't completely get rid of it before Saturday, we can still do what we can to neutralize the thing." "Exactly," Will said. His fingers tightened on Rosemary's, a gentle pressure she knew was intended to let her know he would be there for her no matter what. "Between us, we've vanquished a lot of demons. One little troublemaker isn't going to be a problem." She really wanted to be that optimistic about the situation. After all, the demon hadn't done anything outwardly destructive so far. No, it seemed like the kind of entity much more dedicated to stirring up shit. "Sure," she replied, hoping she sounded confident and not at all worried. "So I suppose I know what we're doing for the next few hours." "I've got supplies in the car," Michael responded. "And I have to assume you've got plenty of white candles, since you'd need them for the wedding anyway?" "We will tomorrow," Rosemary said with a limp smile that probably wouldn't have fooled anyone. "They're being delivered with the table linens and the place settings." This bit of unwelcome information made Michael's brows pull together for a moment, but then he shrugged, saying, "Well, I've got a few in the car with the rest of the stuff. We'll just make do with putting them in the most important locations, the bedrooms we're using, the kitchen, the family room. That will probably be enough, since we'll also be putting wards in place as well." He sounded sure of himself, so she didn't bother to argue. Maybe they could have all jumped in the car and headed to the nearest Michael's to load up on more candles, if they even had one here in Santa Barbara, which didn't seem as chain store friendly as a lot of other towns in Southern California. But as jumpy as she was feeling, the fewer side trips the better. Except, of course, that running those sorts of errands would at least get them away from Vista de los Robles for an hour or so. "Speaking of which, what should we do for dinner?" she asked then. "Go out again?" To her surprise, Michael shook his head. "No, I think it's better to order in. These sorts of beings are often more active after dark, and I want to see if it tries to interfere with our meal, or whether all the wards and the holy water and the white candles will be enough to keep it away." "But if you want to go out, we can do that instead," Will said, and she had to smile at the concern in his voice. Clearly, he was going to do whatever was necessary to keep her happy. Everyone was quiet then, obviously waiting for her to make the decision. Michael was the expert here, with Audrey almost as knowledgeable about negotiating the strange world of spirits and demons, but Rosemary was the bride, and she knew they all thought she should have the final say about such matters. As much as she wanted to leave and not come back until late at night, not that the house would be any less scary after dark, she also understood that running away temporarily wasn't going to solve a damn thing. Better to go along with Michael's plan and hope for the best. Depending on what happened tonight, it might provide some insight as to what might go down when the rest of the wedding party showed up tomorrow. "We'll stay," she said. "Although we'll have to check to see who else delivers out here. Will and I had Ty yesterday, but we should probably switch it up tonight." "You and Audrey can check on that," Will suggested. "Michael and I will get the supplies out of the car." "Sure," Audrey said, now looking a little more cheerful than the situation probably warranted. "I'll get my laptop from my room, and then we'll do our research." There wasn't much left to do except agree to the plan, and the two women headed inside while Michael and Will took the path that led away from the terrace and over to the large garage where Audrey's RAV4 was parked. As Rosemary waited at the foot of the stairs for Audrey to come back down with her laptop, a trickle of cold worked its way down her back. She sure hoped they were doing the right thing.
Although Rosemary looked as though she was doing her best to roll with the situation, Will knew better. Her delicate features were still tense, and her gaze kept darting everywhere, as though she expected the demon to materialize right in front of them and start causing chaos. That didn't happen, though. No, he and Michael got white pillar candles burning in the 4 spaces they thought the most important: the bedroom suites they were currently occupying, the kitchen, the family room. And they also splashed holy water in the most commonly traveled areas of the enormous house. But when it came time to lay down some wards and spells of protection, that was when the first disagreement cropped up. "We should do the Ward of Solomon," Will suggested, and Michael immediately shook his head. "I don't think it will be strong enough against this thing, especially when we don't know its name," he responded. "You don't have to know the demon's name for it to work." "Michael's right," Audrey cut in. "He's done this sort of thing a lot more times than you have." Maybe so, but Will found himself compelled to offer another argument. Maybe so, but the Ward of Solomon is one of the most reliable wards we can use. I think it's better to use something tried and true when we still don't know exactly what we're working with. "Tried and true won't help that much if we're dealing with something powerful enough," Michael said, his tone now downright testy. "Maybe you should back off and let the experts handle this." Anger flared in Will, and he opened his mouth to speak, to let Mr. High and Mighty Covenant know he wasn't the be-all and end-all when it came to dispelling demons. However, Rosemary stepped in between them, hands held up as though she thought she needed to intervene physically to stop them from bickering. "Listen to yourselves. What the hell is that matter with you?" As soon as it had come, the annoyance that had made him snap at his friend disappeared. Will shook his head. "I'm sorry. I don't know what came over me." Michael's eyes narrowed, not, Will thought, in further irritation, but because he just had an unpleasant thought. "This isn't us," he said. "This is the demon." Audrey stared at her husband in bewilderment. "You're saying the demon could somehow make us squabble like that?" "That's exactly what I'm saying." He paused there, arms crossed, before continuing. "I haven't experienced anything like this before, but I've read about these sorts of disagreements happening when a demon sends out a bunch of bad vibes, for lack of a better phrase. Its entire purpose is to get people riled up, because it feeds off their negative energy. Plenty of negative energy had been flying around the room a moment earlier, that was for sure. Now more tired than anything else, Will asked, "So how are we supposed to guard against it?" "Mostly by recognizing that this is one of its little tricks," Michael replied. "If you feel yourself getting annoyed or upset about something, slow down and ask yourself if the situation genuinely demands that sort of response or whether you're getting worked up over nothing. Once you understand what it's doing, it's a lot harder for it to manipulate you." Although Will knew this advice made a lot of sense, he couldn't help being angry all over again. Not at his friend, of course, but at the unknown entity that seemed to get its jollies by making them all riled up. But as Michael had just said, forewarned was forearmed. He'd be on his guard going forward, that was for sure. Will glanced over at Rosemary, who appeared worried but definitely not angry. "It didn't seem to affect you," he said, and she frowned a little. "No, I don't think it did," she replied. "I mean, it upset me to see the two of you arguing, but I wasn't angry." "Unlike me," Audrey said, now obviously sheepish. "I felt like I had to jump in and take Will down a peg, even though I know intellectually that he has a lot of experience with demons too, and that his opinion should be respected and listened to." Michael listened to all this, comprehension dawning as he seemed to put the puzzle together. "It's because Rosemary is the only one of us with angelic blood," he said. "The demon's tricks can't work on her because of that." Her forehead was still slightly puckered, telling Will she wasn't sure if she should buy that argument. "If that's the case, then why did I hear it knocking on the wall last night?" "Because it was interacting with a physical object," Michael replied, looking unperturbed. "It wasn't trying to influence your mind. Now that we know what it's doing, it's going to have a much harder time getting to any of us as well." That was something, Will supposed. However, he hated the idea of having to be on his guard the entire time they were here, of not being able to relax and enjoy himself. Instead, he was going to be forced to analyze every word, every interaction, to make sure it was something that truly came from his own thoughts and emotions instead of being manipulated into reality by the demon. To his surprise, Michael came over and clapped him on the shoulder. "It's not as bad as it looks," he said. "We'll get those wards in place, and I think we'll have an easier time of it after that." He paused there, clearly thinking rapidly. "All the same, we also need to start doing some research on this house, because that demon wouldn't be here if it hadn't somehow been invited."
Chapter 6. Something did feel better about the atmosphere in the house after the four of them recited the spells of warding Michael and Will agreed upon. Rosemary couldn't say quite what it was and had to admit to herself that the effect might have been purely psychological, but still, a certain heaviness left her shoulders, and she felt as though she could now breathe easier. "I'm going to reach out to Fred and see what he can tell us about the history of the house," Michael said as they all gathered in the family room. By that point it was well past 6:30, and they'd probably need to start thinking about ordering dinner soon. First though, they had much more important business to handle. "We already looked it up," Will said. He sat next to Rosemary on the couch, while Michael and Audrey were seated on the love seat that faced the sofa. "I suppose it's possible that the 20s-era movie stars who built the place had crazy satanic rituals in the basement or something, but I don't find that very likely." "Probably not," Michael agreed. "But I'm not talking about the kind of information you can easily find online. You know Fred is a genius at ferreting out the good stuff." No one bothered to contradict that statement, since it was the simple truth. Rosemary still didn't know exactly how Fred managed it, some kind of magic of his own maybe, but he could dig up facts that had been buried for years. If anyone could get to the bottom of this, it was Izzy's husband. "He'll probably want to know why we're asking now," she pointed out. "And I'll tell him the truth," Michael replied at once, looking unfazed. "Aren't you worried that's going to get him and Izzy hurrying over here to lend a hand?" Michael didn't even blink. "Doubtful. While having your sister join her powers with the rest of us might be useful, Fred isn't psychic and doesn't have any experience fighting demons. He can help us out a lot more by doing his research at home, and then sharing whatever he finds. Besides, the two of them were going to be here by lunch tomorrow anyway." Well, that was true. Although Rosemary still found herself surprised from time to time that her serious, upright sister had married a tattooed guy with a ponytail and a penchant for hacking databases when he wasn't riding his Harley, the two of them worked well together and were both fully capable of making decisions based on common sense and not pure emotion. Isabel would realize that Michael and Audrey and Will and Rosemary could handle the current situation just fine on their own, and that there wasn't any reason to go rushing off to Santa Barbara. That was what Rosemary hoped anyway. While she felt better that they'd gotten some rudimentary protections in place, she also knew that far too many unanswered questions remained. As Michael was fond of pointing out, you shouldn't take anything for granted when dealing with a demon. They all remained silent while he got out his phone and sent off the text to Fred. As Rosemary had expected, the answer came back at once. Fred Penasco wasn't the sort of guy to keep his phone too far away unless he was out on a ride. At this time of the evening, and especially since he would be going on a road trip with his wife the next day, he was sticking close to home. "He's working on it," Michael announced, somewhat unnecessarily. "In the meantime, though, is there anything else you can think of to ask him?" "You should have him check into the years when the house was unoccupied," Will said. "From what Rosemary and I read, the years between the early 1960s and the 1990s seem like kind of a dead zone. Someone must have been taking care of the place, or otherwise it would have been a massive project to get it to its current condition. But we couldn't find any information on what was going on with the house then." Michael gave an approving nod. "That does sound a little sketchy. I'll have Fred look into it." And he picked up the phone and sent off another rapid-fire text. A ping indicated the message had been responded to, and Michael glanced down at his iPhone screen for a moment before returning his phone to his pocket. "He says he's going to put extra emphasis on those missing years," he said. "And that he'll get back to us as soon as he finds anything." "Which means we might as well order dinner," Audrey commented. "I know it's only been about 5 hours since lunch, but it feels like forever and I'm hungry." Rosemary realized then she was hungry too, even though she'd had a big plate of chicken enchiladas in addition to her margarita and all those chips. "Yes, dinner," she said, glad they had something concrete they could focus on for a while. "And maybe by the time we're done, Fred will have some information to give us." Everyone seemed on board with that plan, so Audrey borrowed Michael's phone and called the Greek restaurant they'd all agreed on earlier in the day. It would be something very different from Thai, but still not as carb-loaded as pizza or Italian. Although Rosemary purposely had chosen a wedding gown that was slim-fitting without being overly tight, she still didn't think it would be a great idea to load up on bread or pasta 2 days before the wedding. They were having a catered meal here at the house for the rehearsal dinner, tapas and other small bites that would be tasty without being too heavy, so all she needed to worry about was getting past tonight. That, and trying to figure out exactly what the demon was, and why it had taken up residence in Vista de los Robles.
Despite everything that was going on, it felt good to sit down with their friends in the enormous dining room here at the mansion. What with Michael and Audrey being hundreds of miles away in Tucson, Will and Rosemary hadn't had much of an opportunity to do something as normal as getting together for dinner. Even if Audrey and Michael had already moved back into the big craftsman house only half a mile from his own place, Will doubted they would have had too many dinners at the much more modest house he called home. There was a dining area, but it was small and not very conducive to having guests. Part of the plan for remodeling the house involved expanding the kitchen and dining room, in addition to adding another bathroom and bedroom. But even if they decided to start working on it right at the start of the new year rather than waiting until April, the place still wouldn't have been ready until summer at the very earliest. And although Rosemary had the money waiting to go, thanks to how much she'd gotten from the sale of her house in Glendora, Will had wanted to hold back for a while. Not because he was unsure of their future together, far from it, but because he sort of hated the idea of her being the one to fund the project. He felt as though he should be contributing more than just the house itself, a notion that she'd told him on more than one occasion was just silly. After all, as she'd pointed out several times, they wouldn't be doing any kind of remodel if he hadn't already owned the house they were adding on to. "To being together," Michael said as he raised his glass, and everyone lifted their wine glasses so they could perform the traditional clinks as they echoed his words. "Even in a demon-infested mansion," Rosemary replied with a grin. But Michael didn't smile. "I wouldn't call it infested," he said. "Not when we're only dealing with one entity here." Sitting at his right, Audrey gave her husband a curious look. "How can you tell it's only one?" "Just a feeling," he said. "I don't have the impression that we're getting tag-teamed." Hearing that reply, Audrey gave a lift of her shoulders and sipped from her wine again. Most likely, she was reminding herself that demonology wasn't an exact science, and that it was probably better to go with Michael's instincts on this one. And to be fair, it wasn't as if they had phenomena occurring all over the mansion. Just those knocks last night, and that weird eruption of hostility a little while ago, when they were all together in the family room. Although he hadn't been called in to assist with the infestation at the Whitcomb mansion in Glendora, Will had seen some of the footage and knew how bad it could get when you were dealing with multiple entities all on the attack at the same time. "Then that should make it easier for us to focus our efforts," he said, as he helped himself to a lamb dolmade. "Once we find out what we're facing, of course." Michael nodded, a certain faraway look in his eyes signaling that he was reaching out again with his heightened perception, doing his best to determine where their adversary might be. Will suppose Rosemary could have done the same thing, but she seemed to be holding back, as if worried that if she engaged too directly, she might provoke another attack. "I don't even think it's here right now," Michael said after a pause, and Audrey's eyebrows lifted. "You're sure?" A hint of a smile touched Michael's lips. "Well, it's hard to be absolutely sure about anything when you're dealing with a demon, but the vibes right now are very quiet. If it was still lurking around, eavesdropping on us, then I'd like to believe I would have been able to sense something of its presence." Will definitely didn't like the idea of the demon listening to every word they said, and if Rosemary's sudden frown was any indication, She wasn't too keen on the concept either. However, her tone was light enough as she asked, "So demons aren't omniscient?" Michael shook his head and Audrey replied, "Not that we've been able to tell. Sure, they see a lot more than an ordinary human or even an ordinary ghost. But there are limits to their abilities, and they have definite blind spots." Thank God for that. Although Will firmly believed that the divine spirit and its angels were far more powerful than any demon, he also didn't want to acknowledge that the denizens of hell had their own special powers, diabolical talents that could be brought to bear when they had a human victim in their sights. "Good," Rosemary said, her tone firm. "Because I want to be able to enjoy this moussaka in peace." Everyone chuckled at her remark, and when she gave a swift glance in Will's direction, he understood she'd made the little joke to try to lighten the mood a bit. Her stratagem seemed to have worked, because Audrey asked then about the band Rosemary had hired for the reception, and Rosemary launched into a story about how she'd been agonizing over what kind of music to have for the gathering, and how she'd stumbled across an amazing jazz trio that could play all sorts of standards. She wasn't much of a rocker at heart, but still wanted something people could dance to, and the group she'd found fit the bill perfectly. Just as she was finishing up, Michael's phone rang in his pocket. He sent them all an apologetic look, even as he dug it out and looked down at the screen. "It's Fred," he announced. "Better put it on speaker, just in case," Audrey said, and her husband nodded. "Hi, Fred," he said. "I've got you on speaker so we can all hear what you're saying. Did you find anything?" "Some bits and pieces," came Fred's voice from the iPhone's tiny speaker. "I don't know if any of it explains the phenomena you've been experiencing there, but this is what I dug up so far. The mansion was built in 1924 by a director named Albert Fields for his wife, Mary Norman, who I guess was a big silent movie star. They had a daughter named Natalie. She inherited the place after they died, and lived there until the 1950s, when it looks as if she fell on some hard times and sold the place." "Did you find anything that pointed to any sort of paranormal activity in the house during those years?" Michael asked. "No," Fred replied. "As far as I could tell, Albert and Mary did all right for themselves. He transitioned into directing talkies, and she sort of retired from the movie industry and focused on being a hostess for Albert's many parties." During this, Michael retained the same sort of interested expression he'd worn all along, but Will thought he could detect a flicker of disappointment in his friend's eyes upon hearing that piece of news. Still, he sounded neutral enough as he said, "Do you know who bought the house after that?" "Yes," Fred said, sounding cheerful. "A man named Leonard Samuels. He made a fortune in the oil business and bought the place with furniture included. He moved his family into the house in 1953. "Family?" Michael echoed. "A wife and 2 daughters, Eileen and Eleanor. Twins, it sounds like." That piece of information made Michael send a significant glance at his wife. True, on their own, twins weren't necessarily any more notable than regular sets of brothers and sisters, but they did tend to attract more paranormal activity than people who didn't have siblings they were so closely connected to. "Any information on Eileen and Eleanor?" A sound like a couple of pieces of paper being shuffled around came through the phone's speaker. Although Fred did all his work on his computer, Will knew that the other man still liked to jot down what he felt were the most important bits and pieces, just so he wouldn't lose track of them. "Looks like they were around 12 when their father bought the house. Nothing really significant seemed to happen until about 10 years later, when Eileen was supposed to get married at the property." "Supposed to?" Rosemary repeated, speaking for the first time. "What happened?" "There was a fire the morning of the ceremony," Fred replied. "Took out the kitchen and the rooms above it, one of which was Eileen's. She died, and so did their mother, as she was in the suite with her helping her daughter get ready." Good God. There was certainly no sign of damage in those rooms now, but it was already obvious that the kitchen had been updated within the last 5 years or so, and he assumed the rooms on the floor above it would have been similarly repaired and modernized. "Maybe we really are dealing with ghosts after all," Audrey murmured, but Michael only tilted his head to one side, face grim. "No, there aren't any ghosts," he said. "At least, Eileen and her mother didn't become earthbound following the tragedy. What happened after that, Fred? Leonard Samuels said the house was cursed, and he abandoned the place and moved down to Los Angeles. It stood empty for years before the current management company took it over and restored it, and started using it for special events and corporate retreats. A small silence fell after everyone heard that piece of information. Will couldn't really blame the man for wanting to leave the house that had claimed the lives of his wife and daughter on what should have been one of the happiest days of their lives. "What happened to Eleanor?" he asked. "Not sure," Fred replied. "At least, I haven't been able to find any concrete information about her after that. She might have gone to LA with her father, but so far, there aren't any records of her getting married, and no death certificate either. I suppose she could still be alive, since she'd be in her 80s. Wherever she is, though, she's done a pretty good job of covering her tracks." Apparently so. Michael had known Fred for a lot longer than Will had, but during their briefer acquaintance, it didn't seem as if he'd ever come across a case where he simply couldn't find the information he was looking for. It just sometimes took longer than any of them would like. "Well, keep hacking at it," Michael said. "If Eleanor Samuels is still alive, then she might be able to provide some information about the cause of the fire. Otherwise, we'll just have to see what we can do on our end over here." "Got it," Fred replied. "But if you don't hear from me before then, we'll see you tomorrow around noon." "See you then." The call ended there, and Michael picked up his phone and slipped it back into his jacket pocket. As usual, he wore a loose-fitting black jacket over a black shirt and pants, a uniform he'd sported on a daily basis ever since Will had met him almost 10 years ago. "That gives us a little more to go on," he said. "But not a lot. However, the pricking of my thumbs tells me that was no ordinary fire." "You think the demon caused it?" Audrey asked. Her eyes had widened slightly, but the skeptical note in her voice appeared to signal she wasn't quite ready to go that far. He shrugged before reaching for his glass of Cabernet. "It's one theory. Some people might say I'm going out on a limb here, but I'm not so sure about that. From everything Fred just told us, it doesn't sound as if anything untoward happened here until the Samuels had been here living in the house for a while and were planning a wedding under this roof." Those words made Will's stomach sink a little, and next to him, Rosemary shifted in her chair. The last thing either of them wanted to think was that holding another wedding on the premises was what had stirred the demon into action once again. But Audrey appeared calm enough as she gazed back at her husband. "I'm not sure if I can make that connection," she said. "I mean, there must have been plenty of weddings held here after the management company bought it and restored the place. Somehow I doubt it's all been family reunions and corporate retreats or whatever." For just a second, Michael's eyes narrowed slightly. "You might have a point there," he replied. "I suppose it shouldn't be too difficult to look that sort of thing up. I'll send a text to Fred to have him check into that as well." Rosemary didn't appear too convinced by this line of inquiry. "I know they've had weddings here," she said. "It's right on the website for the management company." "I'll go get my laptop and look it up," Audrey offered. "It's still in the family room, so it'll only take a sec." "That might be a good idea," Will said. She ducked her head before pushing back her chair so she could get up from the table. A quiet moment passed as everyone waited for her return, none of them seeming eager to eat while she was away. But then she came back into the dining room and set her laptop down on the table in the open spot next to her place setting. "It's Vista Del Mar Management, right?" she asked. "That's the one," Rosemary replied. Audrey typed in a few words, then swiveled the laptop so its screen would be visible to everyone. The home page for the management company showed a gorgeous aerial view of the property, probably taken by a drone. She navigated to the drop-down menu and clicked on the Special Events tab. Sure enough, there was a series of wedding photos in outdoor settings, most of them framed with trees or other greenery in the background so you couldn't make out much of the house. In fact, you couldn't see any real distinguishing features in any of the images. "Those are stock photos," Michael said, tone emphatic. Will had been thinking much the same thing. They made an effort to find images where the trees and other greenery were similar to what you can find on the property here. But there's absolutely nothing in any of those photos that can prove they were taken at Vista de los Robles. Damn, you're right, Rosemary said. She made a disgusted sound before adding, "How could I have possibly missed that?" "Because we weren't looking for it," he replied. They decided on this venue together, so there was no way in the world he would allow her to blame herself for not noticing that the management company's website might not have been entirely truthful when it came to representing the sorts of events held there. What about the photos for the corporate retreats? Audrey navigated to that page. In contrast to the wedding imagery, the interiors and the grounds of the mansion were immediately recognizable in those shots. A nod, and Michael said, "It makes sense. They need bookings to recoup the investment they made in this property, and they know it would look strange not to advertise such a beautiful setting as a wedding venue. But someone at the management company must know about the history here. I have a feeling they've done their best to fend off any prospective brides and grooms by telling them it's not available on their chosen dates. Then why would they take our booking, and at such a reduced price?" Rosemary asked. "Shouldn't they have told Will and me to get lost, like they supposedly have everyone else?" "Okay, I haven't quite figured out that part," Michael admitted. He ran a hand through his shaggy dark blonde hair and reached for his glass of wine again. Audrey looked similarly troubled. She closed her laptop and pushed it away before returning to the souvlaki on her plate, which was probably starting to get cold. "What if?" she said, then stopped abruptly, as though she wasn't quite sure whether she wanted to continue. "What if what?" Will prompted her, and she released a breath before sending an uncertain look in Rosemary's direction. "I'm not sure I even want to say it out loud." "If you thought of something, then you need to tell us," Rosemary said. "What if the management company knows all about the demon?" Audrey asked, uncertainty clear in her expression, although it didn't stop her from adding, "What if they agreed to have your wedding here because they knew we were a bunch of demon hunters?" "That's not exactly common knowledge, Audrey," Michael replied, although his tone was much gentler than it had been a moment earlier. Pink touched her cheeks, and Will had a feeling that Audrey wished she'd never brought up the subject at all. "Maybe not," she said. "But it's also not a state secret. Project Demon Hunters was a pretty visible item back before it got shelved. And you can't deny that people in certain circles know you and will have worked together in the past. If the property managers knew about the demon and couldn't get rid of it, doesn't it seem logical enough that they might make an exception to their rule about having weddings here, in the hope that we'd be able to banish the thing once and for all?" Once again, silence reigned around the dining room table. This was an angle Will had never thought of, and if the way Rosemary's pretty white teeth caught on her lower lip was any indication, such a thing hadn't occurred to her either. "All right," he said, figuring he might as well be the first one to speak. "If that's the case, then what do we do next?" Michael smiled, then downed the few remaining swallows of Cabernet in his glass. "I guess we'll just have to oblige them by banishing the demon."
Chapter 7. Was any of this real? Was there even the slightest possibility that Priscilla St. John and the team at Vista Del Mar Property Management had lured them here in the hope they'd be able to cleanse the property? Rosemary didn't want to believe a single word of it. However, as she mentally replayed her conversations with Ms. St. John, she realized there had been something a little off about their interactions. Yes, she'd gotten the lead from Fred that the property was available, but when she first called, the receptionist who'd answered the phone had told her no. She was sorry, the mansion was booked that weekend, but Rosemary could leave her name and some details about the wedding, and they'd see if they could work something out if she was flexible about her dates. And then Priscilla had called back and said actually, the cancellation was real, and that the receptionist had gotten it wrong, and that she'd love to host the McGuire-Gordon wedding at the venue. Had Priscilla taken the time to look up Rosemary and Will, and then realized Mr. Gordon, the Episcopalian priest, had certain connections to Michael Covenant, noted demon hunter? When she thought about it that way, Rosemary thought the whole scenario sounded absolutely far-fetched. However, she couldn't deny that the wedding photos on the management company's website had looked pretty fake. And if those were just a false front, an illusion, what else had Miss St. John been lying about? Will she give us an additional discount if we manage to get rid of the demon? Rosemary quipped, but no one smiled. She should give you the whole damn thing for free, Michael said. I never charge people for performing exorcisms or cleansing houses. They're under enough mental strain as it is without worrying about how they're going to pay for my help, but this is different. She was willing to risk your entire wedding just to get some free demon extermination. If that's even what's going on, Audrey replied. She still looked pale and strained, and clearly was wishing she'd never brought up the subject in the first place. We're just speculating at this point. True, Michael said. But the scenario makes a lot of sense. I'd be a lot more willing to think kindly of Ms. St. John if those wedding photos on her company's website weren't completely fake. It's one thing if they'd used some stock images here and there to pad things out, but to have real photos for the company events and retreats but all stock stuff for the weddings? Something doesn't smell right. This all made sense, too much sense. Unfortunately, they couldn't go to Priscilla St. John with their concerns unless they had a lot more evidence on their side. Maybe Fred would be able to dig up the facts they needed, and maybe not. There just wasn't a lot of time, not with him and Izzy getting on the road early tomorrow. And if Rosemary knew her sister at all, she guessed that Isabel would have a few choice words for her husband if he tried to stay up until all hours unraveling the mysteries of Vista de los Robles, rather than getting a decent night's sleep so he'd be rested for their trip the next morning. Well, Will said, we can still do some investigating here. If the demon came along around the time of Eileen's wedding, then someone must have summoned it, right? Maybe there's still some evidence of the summoning ceremony somewhere in the house. Michael lifted an eyebrow. Will, that ceremony would have taken place more than 60 years ago, and the place has been remodeled since then. You really think there's going to be any evidence left behind? You and Audrey found plenty of evidence in the basement of the Whitcomb mansion, Will pointed out. Although Michael didn't quite sigh, he did appear to relent, saying, okay, that's fair. I suppose the first thing we should do after dinner is find out if this place even has a basement. A lot of houses in California don't. True enough. However, the mansion was old, of about the same vintage as the house Will and Rosemary shared, and she knew they definitely had a basement. All right, it was more what people called a California basement, meaning that only part of it was a cellar in the true sense of the word, while the rest was a sort of glorified crawlspace. And while she didn't like the idea of poking around in Vista de los Robles' basement, she was even less enthusiastic about the idea of having her wedding interrupted by a demon's antics. Besides, it would be the four of them investigating the space together. It wasn't as if she would be going down there alone. Okay, she said, reaching for her wine glass so she could have a swallow of Cabernet. After dinner, we'll go exploring.
Although it had been Will's suggestion that they check out the basement, he still wasn't entirely happy to go trooping down there once the group was finished with their meal of Greek takeout and had put the sparse leftovers in the fridge. Dark, enclosed spaces always put him on edge, and he rarely ventured into the cellar in his own house, unless it was time to pull out the Christmas decorations once again. No sign of boxes of holiday decor down here, that was for sure. The stairs that led downward were tucked away in the butler's pantry, a part of the house they'd barely explored yet. As the four of them descended the stairs, he could see that the basement here seemed to be a large, blank space, with a few sticks of furniture set up against the walls, and nothing else visible, except the furnace on the far side of the room, which he guessed had replaced a boiler at some point. At least it had adequate lighting, even if that was just bare bulbs installed at regular intervals in the plaster ceiling overhead. Michael had gone to the car and gotten out a flashlight, but it dangled unused in one hand. Then again, it would still be good to have in case the lights went out. Audrey was the first to speak. I don't see anything down here. Disappointment was clear in her voice, but Michael didn't appear daunted. Not yet, he replied. But we haven't really started looking yet. Let's fan out and see if we can find anything that seems out of place. Will didn't quite know what his friend expected them to find. As far as he could tell, there was a whole bunch of nothing down here. But he knew Michael wouldn't go back upstairs until they'd scoured the entire basement. So he headed off to the left while Michael went to the right, and Audrey turned to investigate the space behind the stairs. Rosemary, on the other hand, moved straight ahead, walking slowly as she glanced all around her from the ceiling to the floor and back again. What she thought she would find, Will wasn't sure. Off to the left, there wasn't anything except a smooth concrete floor and an equally smooth plaster ceiling above him. Yes, that ceiling had a few darker splotches, probably from decades-old leaks, but leaky plumbing wasn't exactly a sign of demonic activity. Then Rosemary said, "I think there's something odd over here," and everyone immediately turned to look in her direction. "Odd, how?" Will said, then hurried over to be with her. As far as he'd been able to tell, the section he was searching didn't have anything strange about it, and if the demon was about to erupt through the floor or something, he wanted to be at her side, even if he knew she'd probably be better at fending it off than he would. She pointed at the floor directly in front of her. At first glance, it seemed like the rest of the smooth gray concrete that covered the ground in the rest of the basement. But then he thought he spied the faint outline of a rough rectangle about a foot away from where she stood. Michael and Audrey also hurried over and stared down at the section of floor in question. "I see it," Michael said. "Looks like it was patched," Audrey added. "That wasn't the first thing I noticed, though," Rosemary said. "As I was approaching, I started to get a creepy, crawly feeling down my back. And then, when I looked all around, I noticed that odd spot on the floor." Will had never been one to question his fiancée's instincts, not when he knew how psychic she was, and how she possessed entirely separate powers she'd inherited from her angel father. Still, he didn't know how worked up he wanted to get about a patch in the concrete. The basement floor in his own house had a similar patch, left over from the time an overly ambitious tree root had decided to erupt from the ground, causing enough damage to result in some fairly expensive repairs. "I wonder what it's hiding," Audrey said, and Michael's mouth twisted. Nothing good, I'm sure, if Rosemary sensed something off about it. But the only way to find out would be to bring a jackhammer down here. And I have a feeling the property manager might have a few words to say about that. Will could only imagine, and he had a feeling the event insurance he and Rosemary had taken out to cover any possible mishaps wouldn't cover deliberate destruction like that. However, she didn't appear all that worried. No, she looked almost thoughtful, as though she was back in algebra class and someone had just handed her a particularly knotty problem to solve. She crouched down and put a finger against one edge of the patch, then tilted her head so she could shoot an incongruous grin up at all of them. What's the point in having an angelic father if you can't use some of those powers every once in a while? And as Will and Michael and Audrey watched, she drew her finger along the outline of the patch, leaving a glowing trail in her wake, almost like she was using that finger as a welding torch. Only in this case, she was breaking the seal rather than creating one. When she was done, she stepped away, still smiling. "I could probably pry that up," she said. "But I don't want to ruin my manicure." Most of the time, she kept her nails bare. For the wedding, though, she'd gone to the salon next door to her shop in downtown Glendora and gotten an elegant French manicure. Will could see why she wasn't quite ready to risk it by lifting the piece of concrete she'd just freed. He, on the other hand, didn't have a manicure to worry about, so he immediately crouched down and began lifting the concrete rectangle. It was large and heavy, almost 2 feet square, and Michael stepped in at the other end so they could heft it safely out of the way, and then set it down a small distance from where they stood. Under the concrete was bare earth, sandy and reddish. Scratched into it were strange runes and symbols. "Sigils of summoning," Michael said after staring at them for a moment. Will had already guessed as much. Since he knew his friend possessed much deeper knowledge of the various demons and the symbols associated with them than he did, he asked, "Summoning what?" A frown tugged at Michael's brows. "I'm not sure. Some of these symbols aren't familiar." He paused there to pull his phone out of his pocket, then took several snaps of the summoning spell they'd uncovered. "I'll need to do some research." But now that I have this recorded for posterity, I think we need to make sure it's no longer active." From a different pocket in his jacket came one of his ubiquitous plastic bottles of holy water, which he sprinkled all over the sigils scratched into the earth. At once, Rosemary put her hands to her ears, and Will looked over at her in concern. "Are you okay?" She sent him a rueful smile, even as she lowered her hands. "I thought I heard something, a kind of horrible screech." "That would be our demon registering his displeasure," Michael said, and returned the bottle of holy water to his pocket. Rosemary's eyes widened, and Will reached out to wrap his fingers around hers and give them a reassuring squeeze. "Does that mean it's gone?" "No," Michael replied. "Unfortunately, it's going to be harder than that to get rid of it. What it means, though, is that it's going to have a harder time hiding from us." "I'm not sure that's such a good outcome," Audrey remarked. "I mean, if it was coming and going from the property, then at least it wasn't lurking around all the time." Although her tone bordered on disapproving, Michael didn't look too worried. "No, it's always better to be able to keep closer tabs on these beings. We have what we need to ward ourselves against this thing, until I can do some research and figure out exactly what we're dealing with." He sounded utterly confident, but Will wasn't sure whether he shared his friend's optimism about the situation. At least when the demon wasn't trapped in the house with them, they could be guaranteed a little privacy. But Michael had been fighting demons for a long time, and he knew what he was doing. Most of the time, anyway. "And now that we've found what we were looking for," he continued, "we can head back upstairs. I'll get to work trying to pinpoint which demon we're working with, and the rest of you can sprinkle more holy water in all the main areas of the house and make sure those white candles stay lit." With an inward flicker of amusement, Will wondered exactly how much holy water Michael had brought with him to Santa Barbara. Enough, it seemed. Otherwise, he probably would have mentioned camping out in the kitchen so he could refill all those little vials and bless them again. That was one nice thing about being a sworn member of the clergy. You never had to worry about running out of holy water. They climbed the stairs up into the butler's pantry and emerged in the kitchen, only to stare around them in shock. "Someone's been busy," Michael remarked. The refrigerator doors stood open, and the leftovers they'd put in there just a few minutes earlier had been tossed all over the place. More than that, ketchup smeared the white oak cabinets and left a bloody trail along the clay tile floor. "Yes, it looks like our friend had a little temper tantrum," Rosemary said. She didn't appear too upset, more just grimly amused. "I suppose he's pissed off about the way we shut down his escape hatch." "Something like that," Audrey agreed. "Obviously, we didn't sprinkle enough holy water in here." Michael's gold-gray eyes surveyed the destruction. "Something we can fix after we get this cleaned up." Will said, "No, you go ahead with your research. We can take care of the mess. It's better that we know what we're dealing with as soon as possible so we can send the damn thing back to hell." Neither Audrey nor Rosemary attempted to contradict him, which seemed to signal they'd been thinking much the same thing. Looking resigned, Audrey headed back into the butler's pantry, where several mops and brooms hung from one wall, while Rosemary and Will rummaged under the sink to look for some cleaning supplies. Michael hesitated for a moment, appeared to realize it was better to get on with his research rather than argue with them, and headed out to the family room where Audrey had left her laptop behind. For a moment, Will feared that the demon might have tampered with the computer as well, but since he didn't hear any angry exclamations coming from the other room, he had to believe all was well with the laptop. Most likely, it had all sorts of protective spells laid on it, thus keeping any demons at bay. The mess in the kitchen didn't take as long to clean up as they'd feared, and once the last trace of ketchup was scrubbed from the floor, Will picked up the vials of holy water Michael had left behind, and used his fingers to spread the blessed liquid along every surface, murmuring the warding spells his friend had taught him, interspersed with the Lord's Prayer. "That should do it," he said once he'd finished tracing around the door that led to the butler's pantry, the final surface that needed to be protected. "Let's go see how Michael is doing." The three of them left the kitchen and headed into the family room, where Michael had the laptop open on the coffee table. He was hunched over it, eyes intent on the screen. "Find anything?" Rosemary asked. She sounded tired, and Will couldn't blame her. Although he and Audrey had handled the roughest duty in the kitchen, so she wouldn't have to risk her nails once again, he knew his fiancée must be more than weary of dealing with the uncertainty revolving around the demon's capricious actions. "Not yet," Michael said. "Our little friend seems to have a fairly low profile. But I'll figure it out eventually." Eventually. Will wasn't sure he liked the sound of that word, not with the wedding taking place less than 36 hours from now. "But the rest of you should do your best to relax," he added, seeming to notice that his previous remark had landed like a lead balloon. "I don't think relaxing is on the menu tonight," Rosemary said. "Not when we need to finish that second round of protection spells." "I'll do it," Will replied. "You and Audrey can stay here with Michael." Relief shone in his fiancée's face even as she said, "You shouldn't have to do it alone." Before she could reply, Michael put in, "Will's right. He can handle that part of things. It's better if you rest." "If you're sure," she said, her tone now doubtful. "I am," Will told her. "And if I bump into something I need help with, I'll just yell." Rosemary made a face. "If you're on the far side of the house, we might not hear you. That's what cell phones are for." He leaned down and pressed a soft kiss against her lips, hoping she would sense from the embrace that he wanted to do this for her. In so many things, her gifts far outmatched his, but as an ordained minister, he could put extra energy into his spells of protection that even a half-angel couldn't. Seeming to understand that he didn't want to argue about it any longer, she only smiled. "All right. But we'll be here if you need us." "Don't worry," he said. "I'll be fine."
Chapter 8. Despite Rosemary's worries, Will returned to the family room without incident about a half-hour later, saying that the entire house was protected and they should be able to sleep easy. Although she'd only smiled and thanked him, she couldn't help wondering if she'd be able to sleep a wink with the demon trapped in the mansion with them. Or was it? The house seemed unnaturally quiet as they ascended the stairs sometime after that, with Michael no closer to discovering the identity of the being who'd been toying with them for the past day. Audrey's laptop had started running out of juice, which was part of the reason why they decided to have an early night, but Rosemary had no doubt that he'd be right back at it with his research after he got the thing plugged back in. "Do you really think it's gone?" she asked Will in a low voice once they were alone in their suite with the door closed. He lifted his head and gazed around the room. "I haven't gotten any sense of it since I sprinkled that holy water everywhere." Neither had she, but "If it's trapped here, it has to be somewhere," she insisted, and now Will came to her and took her hands in his. "We don't know exactly what was in the summoning spell yet," he said. "This is a big property, remember? We're not using it, but there's the guest house on the other side of the pool. The demon could be in there. That's still at Vista de los Robles, technically, even if it isn't inside the mansion itself." Those words reassured her somewhat. She and Will had gone back and forth about whether they should use the guest house as well, but the main house had plenty of room for everyone, and renting the second structure would have cost them another $1,000 a night. In the end, they'd decided it wasn't worth the extra outlay. In a way, she thought it was sort of funny that the demon might have been banished to the guest house. From what she'd been able to see online, it was plenty big on its own, nearly 1,800 square feet, with 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, a little larger than the house she shared with Will. Whatever it was, the demon shouldn't be too cramped in there. That might be the best way out of this mess. If Michael couldn't figure out what the entity was, and they weren't able to banish it altogether, it shouldn't be able to cause too much havoc if it was confined to an entirely different part of the property. Except that the demon had free rein to roam everywhere except the main house, which meant it could still cause a lot of damage. She released a breath, and Will pulled her close and put his arms around her. Until that moment, she hadn't realized how much she wanted him to simply hold her, to give her the reassurance she craved. He felt so solid, so real. When she could lay her head against his chest like this and hear the slow, strong beating of his heart, she knew he'd make sure that nothing bad happened. "I love you," she said, and he bent down and touched his lips to her hair. "And I love you too," he replied. "We're going to get through this. I promise." Will Gordon always kept his promises, so Rosemary knew she could take those words at face value. She thought of how he'd walked into a house that he knew would be filled with part demons to help her steal back the Project Demon Hunters footage, how he'd stood next to her and the rest of her family, and helped send Belial to hell. All of this without possessing even a scrap of psychic power, the way Michael and Audrey and she did. No, everything he'd accomplished had been through the sheer force of his faith and his will. No pun intended. "Let's go to sleep," she said. And it was a quiet sleep, one unbroken by any nightmares or visitations by their not-so-resident demon. Rosemary awoke, her head still cradled against Will's shoulder, and allowed herself to let out a breath of relief. They'd survived the night, and in a few hours her family would be at the house. Michael and Audrey had already been an enormous help, but she had to think that with her sisters and her mother and her retired angel father here, they'd be able to make short work of the little bastard and send it back where it belonged. She and Will hadn't made love the night before, and Rosemary thought it would probably be better not to initiate any intimacies this morning either. Maybe that was being overly cautious, but until she knew for sure the demon was gone altogether, she just didn't want to make herself that vulnerable. Besides, tomorrow she'd be getting married. Wouldn't it be better to wait, and to have lovemaking with Will feel as if it was for the first time all over again? So she laid a kiss on his cheek and said, "I'm going to shower. Do you need to use the bathroom first?" He smiled and shook his head. "No, I'm good. I got up in the middle of the night." And she hadn't woken up, and the demon had left him alone. Those both had to be good signs, right? "I must really have been dead to the world," she replied. "You needed the sleep." Obviously. She didn't have any real sleep issues, but most of the time, if Will got out of bed to go to the bathroom, or to get a glass of water or whatever, she'd wake up, if only for a second or two to take note of what he was doing before she drifted off again. "Guess so," she said with a grin, and then touched his shoulder in a brief caress before heading off to take her shower. Which was just what she needed, the hot water pounding down on her and kneading away some of the residual weariness in her muscles. Because she was having her hair done for the wedding tomorrow, she'd anchored it on top of her head with multiple clips to get it out of the way, and let the water massage her exposed neck and back. Most likely, she could have taken a much shorter shower and saved some water, but if you couldn't be extravagant on your wedding weekend, then when could you? And it was the weekend, or almost. She wasn't going to give herself too much grief about being a little indulgent this morning. Maybe the guys could run out for coffee and bagels or something, although there was a good supply of excellent coffee here. Rosemary didn't want to take the risk of going out for an extravagant breakfast, not when she didn't know for sure exactly when people would start to arrive. Although nothing had disturbed her during her shower, she still got dressed quickly, putting on her underwear and one of her beloved long skirts, today, with a long-sleeved scoop-neck t-shirt to accommodate the cooler December temperatures. It never got truly cold in this part of the world, but still, it generally wasn't tank-top weather this close to Christmas either. Her prolonged shower had made the room a little steamy, so after she was dressed and had pulled the clips out of her hair to let it fall to her shoulders, she thought she had better open the window to let in some fresh air. The day outside looked blue and sunny, and she didn't think doing so would cool the room down too much. Except when she undid the latches and pushed the sash upward, the demon appeared out of nowhere and settled itself on the windowsill. This was the first time she'd ever seen one in its true form, or at least the form it had decided to adopt during its tenure on this plane. Most demons could shapeshift. Well, that was what Michael and Audrey had told her, and she'd seen Caleb demonstrate that dubious talent more than once, but they tended to be more powerful when manifesting in their actual bodies. Hideous didn't begin to describe the thing. It wasn't very big, maybe the size of a 10-year-old child, which explained why it could fit so well on the windowsill, but it definitely didn't look like a child. Rosemary couldn't even say what it exactly resembled. Not a toad, not an insect, not month-old roadkill, but some horrible combination of all that and more. Not that it mattered what it looked like. "Hi, Rosemary," it said, as if it was her bestie and had just popped in to have a quick chat before they went shopping. "Get off there," she replied, glad to hear that she sounded utterly unshaken. Her heart pounded and her empty stomach turned sour, but at least none of those physical reactions had made it as far as her vocal cords. "You've been banished from this house." The demon didn't look too concerned. Then again, with that monstrous face and those glowing red eyes, its emotions were difficult to read. "So I have," it said. "But your boyfriend in there missed this windowsill. And when I saw you open the window, I thought we should have a chat." "We have nothing to talk about," she replied. It seemed her worries had been correct. The holy water had done its job of keeping the demon out of the house proper, but all that meant was that it now appeared to be roaming the grounds like some sort of unholy flying Dutchman. The demon leered at her, and her stomach churned again. "Oh, I think we do. How does it feel to be second best?" Even though Michael had said on more than one occasion that getting sucked into a conversation with a demon was one of the worst things you could do, Rosemary couldn't help responding, "What the hell are you talking about?" Its reddish-yellow eyes glinted. The pupils were slitted like a cat's, but they didn't seem to be responsive to the bright sunlight outdoors, as if mere earthly conditions had no real effect on them. "You know the good Reverend was engaged before, don't you?" Broke his heart when she threw him away like so much garbage. "Never got over it, not really. That's why you're second best. You're the consolation prize, Rosemary. You'll never measure up. Will's fiancée is an educated woman with a master's degree. You think he respects you, you with your high school diploma and your silly bookshop full of woo-woo crap? To him, you're just a pretty little sex toy. And when he's done with you, he'll throw you out in the trash just like he was all those years ago." Through all this, Rosemary had stood there in a sort of mesmerized horror, her brain trying to come up with some sort of biting rejoinder, and failing miserably. Was this some sort of dark enchantment, demonic mind control? She couldn't know for sure. Then came a knock on the door and Will said, "Rosemary, are you all right? I thought I heard voices in there." The syllable came out in a strangled gasp, and the door opened. Startled silence for the barest second, and then Will practically flung himself into the bathroom, opened the top drawer in the vanity, and grabbed the vial of holy water he'd hidden within. Another second, and then he had it open, and tossed the contents of the vial right in the demon's face. A horrible scream emerged from its throat, and smoke boiled up from its warty mottled skin before it blinked out of existence. Will dropped the vial and pulled her into his arms. "Are you all right?" Was she? The awful things the demon had just told her churned in her brain, but with it gone, she was able to think clearly again and realize it had all been terrible lies spoken with the sole purpose of sowing doubt and discord. "I'm okay," she said. "Thank you for getting rid of it." "Well, thank God it reacted to holy water the way I hoped it would," Will responded. "After dealing with the Greencastle demons, I never know what to expect." Yes, because the group in Indiana had been part human, holy water didn't always have the same effect on them that it did on your run-of-the-mill demon. This time, though, it had definitely done the job. Rosemary managed to put on a crooked smile and say, "Better get in that shower and get ready. I have a feeling Michael is going to want to hear about this."
Both Michael and Audrey listened to Rosemary's story in shocked silence. Because they'd been a little later to come downstairs than she and Will, the almost newlyweds had been able to get some coffee in them before they had to relate what had happened in the main suite's bathroom only a half-hour earlier. Thank God for caffeine. Will still couldn't shake off the rush of terrified adrenaline that had coursed through his body after he opened that door and saw the demon sitting on the windowsill. It hadn't been all that large, nothing like the enormous hulking shape of Belial, but it had packed a lot of ugliness into its pint-sized form. Michael had asked both of them to describe the demon in detail, going over several points more than once, such as the color of its warty skin and the size and shape of the misshapen horns that protruded from its head. Once he was done listening, and once he'd swallowed some more of the Italian roast Will had made earlier, he made an irritated sound. "That doesn't sound like any demon I've ever heard of," he said. Sure, some of the details are similar, but I think this must be some obscure minor entity. Not anything that would have been written about in the grimoires I've collected over the years. Well, that's just great, Rosemary replied. Isn't a big part of dispelling these things, knowing their names? Although Michael still looked more annoyed than anything, Audrey appeared mostly worried. We're running out of time to get rid of it. Yes, I know that. He set his coffee cup down on the countertop. But we have an ace in the hole. We do? Will asked, wondering what his friend was getting at. Michael tilted his head toward Rosemary. John McGuire. He's an angel, and this thing was once an angel too. When we describe it to him, he should be able to tell us its name. Should, Rosemary repeated, not looking terribly convinced. You really think my father would remember something like that? I mean, the fall happened kind of a long time ago. Yes, it had, so long ago, that it was now only a myth to most people. Everyone in this room, however, knew demons were real, and that they once had been counted among the choirs of angels. An amused light entered Michael's eyes. Angels' minds aren't exactly like those of us ordinary mortals. Your father should be able to remember. We have something else on our side, Audrey said. The solstice happens tonight at 2 a.m. Once the world starts to tilt back toward the light, we'll have even more power to stop this thing. Right. It had been more fortuitous timing than anything else that had led to them setting their wedding right on the day of the winter solstice, but Will knew Rosemary had been happy about that, and had told him having the ceremony on a day that was so astronomically charged would only bring them luck. He hoped so, anyway. Rosemary nodded, looking much brighter than she had a few minutes earlier. I'd almost forgotten about that. She paused there, some of the enthusiasm ebbing from her face as she added, on the other hand, I'm not sure I want to be up and around at 2 a.m. the night before I get married. The bags under my eyes are going to be like steamer trunks. Will highly doubted that. Even when she was at her weariest, she still only got a few faint shadows, the sort of thing that could easily be covered up by cosmetics, but he understood her concern. A bride always wanted to look her best. You don't have to participate in the banishing, Michael told her. Between your parents and your sisters and Will and me, we should have this thing handled. Just as Will had expected, Rosemary immediately shook her head. Do you seriously think I'll be able to sleep through something like that? No, we're all in this together, whatever it takes. Audrey had listened to their back and forth, with a faint frown creasing her brow. The one thing I don't understand is how the person who called this demon, whoever it is, even knew to summon it if it was so obscure. A shrug, and Michael said, Oh, it's not that strange. They were probably trying to call something else entirely, and botched the ceremony. It happens a lot. And demons find it amusing when someone tries to call in the big guns and gets a pipsqueak like this guy. I wouldn't exactly call it a pipsqueak, Will remarked. It's caused a good deal of trouble. Minor league stuff, Michael replied, expression unconcerned. Yes, the knocking on walls and the mess in the kitchen were annoying, but you know that's nothing compared to what a demon can do when it really gets going. What about the fire? Rosemary asked. I wouldn't call killing a couple of people and burning down a chunk of the house exactly minor. Before answering, Michael reached for his cup of coffee and took a sip. We don't know for sure that the demon even caused the fire. We don't know that it didn't either, Audrey pointed out. True. At this point, I think the best thing to do is sit tight and wait for reinforcements to arrive. The demon all but admitted that it came to the windowsill in the bathroom because it was the only accessible spot in the house that hadn't been sprinkled with holy water. That means we're safe in here. Will supposed this approach was reasonable, up to a point. What if the demon tries to attack the cars as they're driving onto the property? It seemed Michael had thought about that as well, because he answered immediately, I don't think it will. For one thing, there'll be at least one person in each of those vehicles who's either psychic or has a pretty good track record of fighting demons. Also, haven't you noticed that it gets up to most of its mischief after dark? That thing was sitting on the bathroom windowsill in broad daylight, Rosemary returned, and Michael only lifted his shoulders. I said most. Anyway, if you're worried, Will and I can go sprinkle some holy water along the driveway, just to be safe. That was an awful lot of driveway to cover. Doing it the normal way, sprinkling the water here and there as they walked along, saying prayers the whole time, would take far too much time. Then again, I have an idea, Will said, and placed his cup of coffee on the countertop so he could head into the butler's pantry where the day before he'd spied a couple of items that could make their task a whole lot easier. No one stopped him, although he caught a few puzzled looks as he went. Sure enough, the items in question were sitting on a shelf in the same cubby that held the mops and brooms. He grabbed them both and went back into the kitchen, where he brandished the pair of empty spray bottles he held. Modern problems call for modern solutions, he said, and everyone laughed. Now he'd just have to see if his plan actually worked.
Chapter 9. Audrey and Rosemary stood on the terrace and watched as Michael and Will methodically made their way down the long driveway, spritzing holy water as they went. "I hope no one from the management company is spying on us," Audrey remarked. "Because they'd probably think we were nuts." True, at first glance it seemed kind of crazy to be spraying the drive like this. Then again, if anyone asks, we can say we're just wetting down the driveway to prevent any dust from getting stirred up, Rosemary suggested. "Wouldn't a hose be faster?" She grinned. It felt good to be out here in the sun, to have it warm on her hair as a mild sea breeze tugged at the wayward curls. She hadn't been so preoccupied that she hadn't remembered to check the weather app on her phone to see what tomorrow's forecast was supposed to be, and right now it seemed as if temperatures would be a few degrees above normal under mostly sunny skies. Now, if the demon would only cooperate the way the weather appeared to. "Maybe," she allowed. "But I'd just say a hose would waste too much water. I don't think we need to worry about the management company, though. They seem to have made themselves scarce these last couple of days." Not so surprising, if they'd been maneuvered into this spot so Miss St. John could get some free demon banishing, along with the rental fees. For all Rosemary knew, Priscilla had selected this weekend for them precisely because they'd have the power of the solstice on their side. "I'm sure their guilty consciences are keeping them far, far away," Audrey remarked, a wicked light in her dark eyes. Which was fine by Rosemary. No, they'd wait for the cavalry to show up, have a quiet day on a property well warded by holy water and lots of prayer, and then at the designated hour they'd kick that little bastard right back to hell. All right, it wouldn't be completely quiet, not with a lot of the vendors dropping off their supplies today, so they'd be ready for setup early tomorrow morning, but that was why Izzy had planned to be here earlier than the rest of the gang. She could do traffic control and... Rosemary's thoughts skidded to a halt there. She'd been so preoccupied with thinking about having her family here to help with banishing the demon, that she'd completely forgotten that Will's parents were also supposed to show up late that afternoon. And while they were justifiably proud of their minister's son, they didn't know a damn thing about his demon hunting activities. "What's the matter?" Audrey asked, obviously catching her friend's shift in expression. "Will's parents," Rosemary said briefly. For a second, Audrey only looked puzzled. But then comprehension dawned and she said, "Oh damn. They can't know anything about this." "Well, that would be the optimum solution," Rosemary replied. "I mean, I suppose it's remotely possible that all of us could sneak out of our rooms in the dark of night without them noticing anything, but I don't think that's too likely. And even if we're quiet, it's not as though we can guarantee that the demon is going to keep it down. No, they can get pretty noisy, especially when they realize they're about to get banished." Audrey stopped there, mind obviously doing its best to come up with a useful solution to the problem. "I don't suppose slipping some Ambien into Will's parents' wine at dinner would be a very good idea." Setting aside the ethics of drugging two innocent people, Rosemary knew she would never do something like that, not when she had absolutely no idea how the Gordons would even react to the sleep medication. Besides, they didn't have any on hand, and although Michael had a doctorate in comparative religion, that didn't mean he could write a script and have it filled at the nearest CVS. "We'll have to talk to Will and Michael about the situation," she said. Maybe they'll be able to come up with something. I hope so, Audrey replied. Because otherwise, your fiancé is going to have a lot of explaining to do.
Will also couldn't believe he hadn't thought of the not-so-small wrinkle his parents' presence might throw into their plans, but Michael didn't appear too concerned. We'll think of something, he said. Besides, it's not as if they could have missed all that brouhaha about demons when the Greencastle crew released the Project Demon Hunters footage a couple of years ago. With the driveway safely sprayed down, they'd all gone into the family room to await the arrival of their various family members. Isabel and Fred would probably be first, closely followed by Glynis and John McGuire. Although Will thought he and Michael had done a pretty decent job of warding the place, he also couldn't help thinking he'd feel a hell of a lot safer once they had an actual angel under Vista de los Robles' roof. An angel banned from heaven for putting his family first, true. John might not be able to wield the full force of his angelic powers any longer, but he was still far stronger than any regular mortal, both physically and spiritually. My parents heard about the leaked footage, Will said. They called me and talked to me about it at length. I did my best to reassure them that it was exceptionally good special effects, and since that was the general consensus, after the initial shock and worry wore off, they mostly forgot about the whole thing. But if we have a full-on banishment happening in the upstairs hall in front of their room, they might start to wonder whether I was telling them the truth back then. Rosemary's phone, which she'd brought with her into the family room, made a little ping then, and she picked it up from the coffee table so she could look down at the screen. The relief on her face was obvious. That was Fred, she told everyone. Izzy's driving, so he could still work on his research on the trip up here. Anyway, they just got off the freeway and should be here in about 10 minutes. They'd made good time, obviously, since the original plan was to have them arrive sometime between 11 and 11:30, and it was now only a quarter till. No doubt Isabel had hurried her husband along, worried about her youngest sister and the troubling discoveries the group had made at the mansion. Then let's make a fresh batch of iced tea and get the refreshments out, he suggested. They're probably going to be tired and hungry after the drive. Luckily, they'd already planned ahead for this. The same caterers who would be working the wedding had come by only a few minutes after he and Michael had finished spraying the driveway with holy water and had dropped off trays of sandwiches and bowls of cut-up fruit and several charcuterie boards. That way, people would be able to nibble as they liked throughout the day, up until it was time for the rehearsal dinner. Thank God that would be held indoors, in a place Will knew was sufficiently warded. True, the caterers hadn't had any trouble coming up the drive, and he and Michael had also sprayed down the entire terrace and the lawn where the ceremony would be held, but it somehow felt safer in here, just because the demon had all but admitted that the windowsill was the only place in the house that hadn't been adequately protected against him. Everyone got up from the sofas and bustled around the kitchen, setting out trays and removing the plastic that protected them, Rosemary heating the kettle so they could make a big batch of tea, and put it in the cut-glass punch bowl the caterers had also left behind. By the time Isabel's Subaru came rolling up the driveway, the spread was pretty much ready to go, although they'd have to dump some more ice into the bowl because the tea was still a little too warm. The four of them met Isabel and Fred out on the terrace, and hugs were exchanged before the couple picked up their luggage and brought it inside. Rosemary said you were doing more research on the drive up here, Michael said, clearly glad the pleasantries were over with so they could get down to the real business at hand. Did you find anything useful? A few things, Fred replied. They'd all headed into the kitchen, after leaving the luggage at the foot of the stairs to be carried upstairs later, and he'd placed a few mini sandwiches on a plate along with some fruit. Now he sat on one of the sofas, Isabel next to him, although she seemed more interested in having some iced tea than eating. A trust owns this property, but if you dig into it enough, then you can see that the trust is run solely by Priscilla St. John. Something Will had already thought might be a possibility, so he wasn't too surprised. And judging by the way Rosemary and Audrey and Michael nodded at hearing the news, they'd obviously also entertained that notion. The other interesting thing, though, Fred continued, Is that St. John isn't her real last name? Married name? Rosemary asked, and her brother-in-law shook his head. He was looking a little less wild than usual. His dark wavy hair pulled back into a ponytail, and the tattoos on his arms covered by a long-sleeved t-shirt. But still, no one would ever mistake Fred Penasco for a white-collar kind of guy. No, he said, and now he looked almost amused, as if he knew he'd been holding on to a secret that he couldn't keep back any longer. Priscilla St. John's never been married. Her real last name is Samuels. As in, the Samuels family who owned the mansion in the 50s? Michael asked. Apparently, Fred replied. One twin died in the fire, but the other one, Eleanor, moved to LA and had a daughter there. I'm having a hard time sifting through all of it, but it sounds like Priscilla went to school in the Los Angeles area and then headed back up to Santa Barbara right around the time she turned 30. She's been here ever since. Will glanced over at Rosemary. Some strain still showed around her fine blue-gray eyes and in the lines of her delicate chin, but she also seemed almost relieved, as though she was just glad they were finally getting some answers. But she wanted to hide her connection to Vista de los Robles, so Priscilla changed her name so she could look like a disinterested third party who was managing it, Michael said. Fred shrugged and took another bite of roast beef and provolone on a pretzel roll. That's what it looks like to me, he replied. But without more information, I can't really comment on her motivations. Do we confront her about this? Audrey asked, and Michael immediately said, No. We can handle the situation here without her. Audrey looked dubious. We're just going to let her get away with completely manipulating the situation? I don't think it's a matter of getting away with something, Rosemary said. I mean, I'm not happy that she lied to us, but clearly, whatever's been going on here at the mansion, it's something she couldn't handle. The sad thing is that we would have helped her without being manipulated into it. That's what we demon hunters do, right? Everyone nodded, although Isabel appeared a little uncertain, mostly, Will guessed, because she didn't really consider herself a part of the demon hunting gang, even if she agreed with the general sentiment of Rosemary's comment. Right, Will said firmly. Michael and I have warded and blessed the property, so we think it's pretty safe for now. The important thing is to get through the rest of the deliveries today and the rehearsal dinner, and then we can focus on banishing the demon tonight. Isabel and Fred both looked blank, and Rosemary hurried to explain their plan for getting rid of their unwanted guest at 2:15 in the morning, right after the solstice occurred, and the planet made its usual tilt out of the darkness of its longest night. We still haven't quite figured out what to do about Will's parents, she concluded. The rest of us can participate in the ceremony. Well, maybe not Fred and Kevin, but... Oh, about Celeste and Kevin, Isabel cut in, expression a little embarrassed. She called me while Fred and I were driving up here, and since I'd already let her know something was a little hinky about the house, she told me she didn't want to do anything that might put Tyler in harm's way, so she and Kevin decided to get a hotel room instead of staying here. This last minute? Rosemary asked, and her sister shrugged. I guess that's what Priceline is for. Anyway, they're coming for the rehearsal dinner tonight, and of course they'll be at the ceremony tomorrow, but Celeste just wasn't comfortable having Tyler sleep here. Will supposed he couldn't blame his future sister-in-law for feeling that way, especially after Daniel Lockwood had seized the boy at the Halloween party at Robles Castle 2 years earlier and done his best to use him as a bargaining chip. The hideous imp-like creature who taunted Rosemary earlier this morning looked nothing like Mr. Lockwood, but they had one thing in common. Neither of them gave a damn about human life. That's fine, Rosemary said. Will could tell she was a little disappointed that her other sister was doing her best to stay away, even as she probably understood Celeste's motivations for getting a hotel room. I hope they'll take Tyler to the beach. It's such a pretty day. Celeste said something about that, Isabel replied. And I know they'll be right on time for the rehearsal dinner, especially after I text her and let her know that everything seems to be absolutely calm and quiet around here. Yes, it did. Will knew better than to be lulled into a false sense of security, But between the holy water and the wards, and the simple fact that the demon was outnumbered, and would be even more so once John and Glynis McGuire showed up, he thought the rest of the day should be fairly uneventful. He hoped he wasn't fooling himself.
Although Isabel had assured Rosemary that their parents were up to speed on what had been happening at Vista de los Robles, she still found herself going into a breathless recitation on all the various doings almost as soon as John and Glynis McGuire set foot over the threshold that afternoon. By then, the party suppliers had already dropped off the tables and chairs and the various linens, all of which were being stored in the downstairs library, since they wouldn't be using that space for either the rehearsal dinner tonight or any of the activities the following day. "So we're really hoping you'll be able to help out with the banishment tonight," she concluded, even as Will silently handed her parents some iced tea, and everyone else did their best to look as though they were busy with some sort of task in the kitchen. "Because I don't know what'll happen if we don't get rid of that thing before the ceremony tomorrow afternoon." Her mother laid a hand on Rosemary's arm. "Of course we'll help," she replied, and glanced over at her husband, as though understanding he was the one who would actually provide the most assistance. On the surface, John McGuire looked like an ordinary enough person, tall in his middle 60s with wavy gray hair and keen blue eyes. However, everyone assembled in the mansion's kitchen knew he was much more than that. He didn't reply right away but gazed upward at the ceiling, expression almost blank, as though he was reaching out with his angelic senses to see if he could detect anything amiss in their surroundings. "You've done a good job of warding the place," he said, bringing his focus back toward Rosemary. "I can tell that it's out there, annoyed because it can't get in the house or go anywhere that's connected with the wedding. And I think it knows I'm here, because I get a whiff of fear every once in a while." The relief that flooded through her at those words was so intense, Rosemary was almost dizzied by it. Her father was here, and everything was going to be okay. "Do you know what it is?" Will asked. "None of us have been able to figure that out yet." "No," John replied, deflating Rosemary ever the slightest bit. "It feels like a lesser demon, but there are thousands of those. Hundreds of thousands, actually. I'm surprised it made it to this plane though. Usually imps like that don't have the power to manifest here on Earth." "I thought maybe the person who summoned it was trying for a more important demon, and botched the ceremony somehow," Michael put in, and John tilted his head slightly considering that angle on the situation. "It's possible. Whatever it is, I think we can take care of it when the time comes. Your plan to banish it just after the solstice is a good one." This all sounded great, but "I thought we couldn't banish it if we didn't know its name," Rosemary said. Her father smiled. "Technically, no. But we'll have to confront it directly to send it back to hell, and once I see it, I should know what it is, and the name it's known by." He'd said should and not would, but Rosemary thought she'd be content with her father's view of the situation despite that. His capacities might have been diminished because he wasn't a full-blown angel anymore, but John McGuire still possessed powers that most people couldn't begin to imagine. The only reason he tempered his comments now was that he probably didn't want to sound overconfident. "That works for me," Rosemary said, and everyone chuckled. Her mother came over to her and said, "And since we have some time before the rehearsal dinner, and because the house seems safe enough for now, you can give me a little tour." She looped her arm with her daughter's, and Rosemary gladly led her mother out of the kitchen. Anything to have a few minutes that felt relatively normal. Chapter 10. The rest of the evening felt normal enough too, with Will's parents showing up around 5, and then Celeste and Kevin and Tyler about half an hour after that. Rosemary's fears about the Gordons getting caught up in all this had been allayed by her father, who told her he'd make sure they slept so deeply that no ruckus in the house could possibly wake them. "Not," he'd added, "that I think any of this is going to take place indoors. The demon can't come inside, not with the way the house is protected. We'll have to go out and take the fight to it." She didn't know if she liked that idea too much, bad enough to be up in the middle of the night at all, let alone wandering around in the cold damp of an early morning in late December, but she realized they had to get this done, no matter how uncomfortable the process might be. Other than that conversation, though, there was nothing about that Friday night to make it feel otherworldly. The rehearsal went off without a hitch, with Tyler concentrating with all his might so the fake ring they were using stayed firmly on its pillow, and everyone else doing what needed to be done so they'd know the real ceremony the next day would also go as smoothly. And it wasn't as if they were having some huge do with hundreds of people. Just her and Will with their collection of attendants, and Stan, the senior priest at St. Michael's, driving up from Pasadena to do the honors. He and his wife were staying at a local hotel, and they didn't seem to notice anything off about the house, instead offering praise for its historic beauty, and saying that Will and Rosemary were lucky to have found such a wonderful location for their wedding. She wasn't sure whether luck had anything to do with it, not with what they'd learned about Priscilla St. John, but she'd thank them for driving all this way, especially since Stan would have to hand off Sunday services at the church to the junior priest, Father Longdon, who joined the staff at St. Michael's some 6 months earlier. And Will's parents were just lovely, offering their apologies for his brother and sister, both of whom were at home with their small children. "We're just glad you could make it," she said. "We know it was awfully short notice." Leslie Gordon patted her on the arm. She was tall like her son, with his same clear gray eyes, although her hair was blonde streaked with some silver. "It's fine. We wouldn't have missed it for the world. Would we, Brad?" Her husband shook his head. Like Will, Brad Gordon was tall and dark-haired, but his eyes were hazel rather than crystalline gray. "Of course not. And I have to say, it's nice to get away to California in the winter, if only for a few days." Yes, it was cold and blustery back in Brookline, a huge contrast to temperatures in the high 60s and clear blue skies. Somehow, Rosemary felt better knowing the Gordons were going to stay in Santa Barbara for a few days after the ceremony, getting a hotel room just off State Street so they could enjoy themselves before flying home to Massachusetts for the holidays. But eventually, Stan and his wife and Celeste and her family headed back to their respective motels, and it was time for those staying at Vista de los Robles to get ready for bed. Everyone acted as if it was a perfectly ordinary night, and Rosemary didn't think the Gordons noticed anything off about the way the rest of the group said good evening and went to their rooms. As soon as she shut the door, though, she immediately went to Will and let him fold her into his arms. "How am I supposed to sleep at all?" she asked. His mouth quirked, and he reached down to push a loose curl away from her forehead. "Because you need your rest. I already set an alarm on my phone, and it'll wake us up a little before 2. That will give us enough time to get dressed and meet everyone downstairs. Believe me, that extra 3 hours will make a huge difference." She supposed it would. And to be fair, now that she was here and alone with him, she realized how tired she really was. It had been a very long day, with lots of talk and being social. Her body was telling her it needed to sleep, even if her brain wasn't quite sure it could manage such a feat. A quick kiss, and then they headed into the bathroom, where the window was firmly shut, and washed their faces and brushed their teeth. Afterward, a climb into the tall 4-poster bed, one high enough that Rosemary knew it was only a few inches away from her needing a step-stool to get onto it, and then they snuggled together, breathing slowing, calming. And then they were gone.
Will had been expecting the alarm on his phone to go off, so his hand hit the screen and slapped the button to still the alarm just as soon as the thing began to chime. Next to him, Rosemary stirred, then sat up. "Is it 2 already?" 1:55, he told her. "Time to get dressed." She nodded, before pushing herself out of bed. They both went over to the wardrobe and pulled out practical clothes, jeans and sweaters, as well as boots for him and sneakers for her. Will knew they'd packed those things on the off chance they might need to pitch in and help more with setup than they'd planned, and he was definitely glad of their foresight now. However, neither of them could have imagined requiring those items for an early morning demon hunt. In less than 5 minutes, they were ready to go, so they slipped quietly out of their room and went downstairs. A faint glow coming from the kitchen told them at least one couple had already beaten them there. Sure enough, Michael and Audrey stood at the counter, with Michael staring down at his phone screen. "Is something wrong?" Rosemary asked, and Michael looked up at once. "No," he said. "I was just pulling up the images I took of those sigils we found down in the basement. I kept meaning to show them to your father to see if he could help me with some of the more obscure symbols, but I never got the chance." Will didn't find that too strange. There hadn't been a huge gap between Glynis and John's arrival and the arrival of his own parents, and that meant the opportunity for private conversation had been limited. "What sigils?" John asked, since he and his wife had just entered the kitchen. "These ones," Michael replied, walking over to the older man so he could angle the phone screen toward him. At once John McGuire frowned. "These are definitely spells of summoning, although some of the symbols are crudely drawn, probably by someone who didn't know what they were doing. The demon they were trying to summon was Beleth." Will felt his eyebrows lift, and Michael appeared similarly startled. "They weren't messing around, were they?" Rosemary looked from Will to Michael, and then back to Will again. "Who's Beleth?" "One of the kings of hell, according to the Ars Goetia," Will replied, naming an ancient grimoire familiarly known as the Lesser Key of Solomon. "It's not the sort of summoning anyone should attempt, unless they really know what they're doing. And even then, it's not advisable," John McGuire said, his tone dry. "But now this makes more sense. Beleth commands legions of demons, and he clearly wasn't impressed by the clumsy spell of summoning. Instead, he sent one of his imps to answer the call." "And it's been here ever since?" Rosemary asked, and her father nodded. "That seems to be what happened." He paused there and glanced over at the clock on the stove, which read 2:06. Isabel and Fred appeared then. "Sorry we're late," she said. "Couldn't figure out which bag had my tennis shoes." "It's fine," John replied. "We still have plenty of time." His cool blue eyes met Fred's. "I appreciate you supporting us, but there's really nothing you can do here." Fred planted his hands on his hips. "Sometimes it helps to have a little muscle along, just in case." "Muscle isn't generally what works when you need to get rid of a demon," Michael said. But then he seemed to relent, adding, "Although it would definitely help to have you here watching over the Gordons' room, just in case." Alarm flared in Will. "I thought the demon couldn't get in here." "It can't," Michael said. "But we've been doing this long enough that I think we both know it's smart to hedge our bets." He had a point there. Turning toward Fred, Will said, "Would you mind keeping an eye on their room? I know John has them sleeping pretty soundly, and I hate to think of something happening while they're here alone in the house." This argument seemed to work because Fred replied at once, "All right, I can see that." He kissed Isabel on the cheek. He was only a few inches taller than she, before adding, "You all be safe." And he headed out of the kitchen, presumably so he could take up watch in front of the room where Will's parents were sleeping. "Let's get going," John said.
The night air was colder than Rosemary had expected, maybe because of all the moisture from the ocean less than a mile away. She pulled her jacket closer around her as she marched resolutely next to Will, holding tightly to his hand. The damp grass seemed to soak through her keds, and she wished like anything that she was back upstairs and lying beside him in their warm bed. But she wasn't. No, she was out here at a bit after 2 in the morning, surrounded by her family and her friends, chasing down a demon. Some part of her wondered if this was complete madness. After all, while they were doing their best to be quiet and not attract attention, they decided against using flashlights even though the moon was only a thick crescent in the sky, instead relying on the landscape lighting to guide their way. Any self-respecting demon within a half-mile was going to know they were out here and what they were up to. Before they'd gone to bed, her father had reassured her that the demon wouldn't try to evade them, skulking in the darkness so they wouldn't know where to track it down. Confrontation is in their natures, he'd said. They may play hide-and-seek for a while to toy with their victims, but in the end, they're so sure of their ability to defeat you that they can't stay away. So don't let that worry you. It seemed he'd been right, because as they approached the guest house, the only place on the property that hadn't been warded, a dark shape erupted from the chimney like some sort of perverse reverse Santa Claus. This creature was the farthest thing from jolly, though. It landed on the walkway that led from the guest house to the pool and leered at them, its fangs a dirty yellow in the illumination from the landscape lighting. Rosemary kind of doubted those teeth were any whiter in the clear light of day. Party, party, it said in that same voice, the one which sounded like a metal nail file getting dragged across a rake. Gang's all here. Yes, we are, Rosemary's father replied. They'd agreed beforehand that he should take the lead, mostly because his powers were stronger than anyone else's, and he had the best chance of figuring out who their adversary actually was. You have no place here, Zaraz. Be gone now, or suffer the consequences. So, her father had been able to recognize the thing. Rosemary didn't know whether that particular piece of information changed much about the situation though, since all the demon did after hearing John's warning was to throw back its head and laugh. What consequences? It asked. If I go of my own free will, I'm back in hell. If I stay and fight and am banished there, the end result is the same. But I'm bored after being stuck here for so many years, so do your best. Rosemary shot a sideways glance at Will, whose wide shoulders lifted almost imperceptibly. Was the demon trying to say it could have left at any time, but had remained here anyway? Well, boring or not, Earth still had to be miles better than hell. Who summoned you here? Michael said next. For what purpose? In response, the demon let out a grating little titter of a laugh. Oh, I think you know that already. Connect the dots, as they say. Who would be so desperate as to scratch those symbols into the earth in that basement? Who would want to destroy pretty Eileen's happiness out of sheer jealousy? Eleanor, Rosemary whispered, and the demon cackled again. Bingo. You win the prize. They were identical, and yet not. Everyone loved pretty Eileen. Eileen had the fiancé and the big wedding, and Eleanor wasn't happy. She'd heard things, you know, from the wicked priest who came here to say mass. He wasn't a good man, despite all his words of God. Eleanor knew what to do. Will's chin went up. Apparently not, since she summoned you instead of Beleth and set the house on fire. Those words didn't appear to discourage the demon. Still wearing that horrible yellow grin, it said, I suppose you have a point there. But Beleth certainly couldn't be bothered to cater to the whims of one who only wished to use him as a tool, rather than worship at the altar of his magnificence. I came instead, and I was the one who knocked over that candle. Oops. And it put its hand to its mouth, in a horrible imitation of a schoolgirl trying to hold back a giggle. So it had been the demon who'd started the fire, not Eleanor. Rosemary didn't find herself particularly surprised by that added detail, not when a pack of demons had burned down Audrey's house in Glendora in an attempt to throw her off her stride as she and Michael were trying to close in on Belial. According to Will, demons would use pretty much any weapon they had, and fire was both destructive and something humans were instinctively afraid of. John had listened to all this calmly. The rest of the group stood arrayed on either side of him, all of them well armed with holy water, ready to start lobbing it at the demon at the first sign from him. However, he hadn't made a move yet, only stood there with his hands at his sides, as though it was the most ordinary thing in the world for them to be out there in the middle of the night, having a conversation with a demon. But then Rosemary felt it. She couldn't even say how or why, since many turning points had come and gone throughout the years without her really noticing them. This time, though, it was almost as if the world slipped on its axis for the barest second, her body and mind registering the shift even though nothing around her had changed at all. Her father must have sensed it too, because now he raised a hand to his breast pocket and pulled out one of the vials of holy water, removing the lid so quickly that his fingers were a blur. I cast you out, Zaraz, he cried, voice carrying clear in the cold night air. At the same time, he flung the holy water at the demon. In the name of the Lord and all the hosts of angels, begone from this place. The holy water hit the demon's warty skin, and immediately it began to bubble as though splashed with acid. It shrieked, and Rosemary fumbled for one of the vials she carried with her, knowing they needed to be relentless in their attack. She hurled the holy water at the demon, and everyone around her did the same, bombarding the creature the way her 10-year-old self had once gotten ganged up on by a bunch of neighborhood kids going after her with water pistols. In this particular case, though, instead of getting merely wet, the creature screamed and wailed, loud enough that Rosemary thought the neighbors must surely hear, even as its skin smoked and bubbled, seeming to disintegrate before their very eyes. Well, they'd worry about any noise complaints later. Through all this, her father continued to speak, his voice calm and yet relentless, inexorable as the tide coming in. "I cast you out," he said. "I send you, Zeras, back to the depths of hell. For the Lord is on our side, the Holy of Holies, the Prince of Peace. I cast you out." And with that last, the demon finally disappeared in a puff of smoke, foul-smelling even on the fresh night wind with its hint of sea salt. Will's hand stole into hers, and Rosemary looked around in bewilderment. "Is it really gone?" "It is," her father said. "The power of the solstice amplified our attack, and it was enough to send the thing back to hell." He paused there, and a hint of a smile touched his lips. To be fair, it wasn't all that strong. Will and Michael probably could have banished it, on their own. Will shook his head, even as Michael cracked a relieved grin. "All the same," Will said, "we were more than happy to have you here for the assist." Everyone chuckled, and Will's fingers tightened on Rosemary's as he gazed down into her face, relief clear in every line of his features. "Let's go back to bed," he continued. "Tomorrow, we're getting married."
Chapter 11. Bright sun filtered past the drapes as Will opened his eyes. For just a moment, he wondered where this sensation of deep contentment mixed with anticipation had come from. And then he remembered that the demon had been banished. And today he and Rosemary would be married in a home cleansed of any unholy influences. She stirred next to him, and he leaned over and pressed a kiss against her temple. "Good morning, love," he said. "Ready to get married today?" Her eyes opened, and the most beautiful smile he'd ever seen touched her lips. "Am I ever?" She sat up then and glanced around the room. "It's really gone, isn't it?" "Sent straight back to hell," he said cheerfully. "Nothing more to worry about today than getting all the moving pieces lined up at the right times." A chuckle. "Oh, is that all?" But she was smiling, and he knew neither of them had anything much to worry about, not with Isabel and Glynis playing field marshal, and making sure the caterers and the band and the bartender showed up on time and did what they needed to do. They'd hired several people from a local moving company to set up the tables and chairs, both for the ceremony and the reception. So, as far as he could tell, every I had been dotted and every T had been crossed. Now all they had to do was enjoy themselves. His thoughts strayed to the big shower in the bathroom, and a thrill of arousal went through him as he considered all the things he'd like to do with Rosemary in there. But no, this was their wedding day, and he knew he should save those activities for after the ceremony. For now, they needed to shower and get dressed, and meet up with everyone downstairs for a casual breakfast. A real brunch was planned for the wedding party and their close relatives on Sunday morning, though, giving them all a chance to get together one last time before their friends and family went their separate ways. And he and Rosemary would also have to go their own ways after breakfast today, since Isabel had already informed him that he needed to be out of the picture while his bride was getting ready. No words about bad luck, just the general hint that she and her sisters wanted this to be a surprise. Which was fine. He would be sharing a lifetime with her, so a few hours away wouldn't be too hard. At least, he hoped it wouldn't. The two of them took turns in the bathroom and wandered downstairs a little past 9:30. Voices in the kitchen told Will that he and Rosemary were among the last to arrive, which didn't bother him too much. Although John had done most of the heavy lifting in that encounter with the demon, it was still somehow exhausting to be around the things, to be confronted by the reality of hell in physical form. A rich coffee scent greeted them the second they entered the kitchen. Yes, it looked as though everyone was there except Celeste and her family, although Will assumed they'd be coming along soon enough. "Good morning," Glynis said, and came over to Will and her daughter so she could press mugs of coffee into each of their hands. "I hope you slept well." "We did," Rosemary replied. "Like babies." "That seems to be the consensus," her father put in. "It's often what happens once a demon has been banished from a property," Michael said. A sense of general relief, of ease. Audrey grinned. Good thing too, because we have a big day ahead of us. So I think we all need to fill up now. Easy enough to do. Big trays of pastries and muffins and bagels sat on the long kitchen island with plenty of add-ons, butter and cream cheese and even smoked salmon and lox, along with bowls of cut-up fruit and large pitchers of fruit juice, orange and cranberry and apple. Everyone filled their plates, with the talk now mainly focusing on the absolutely gorgeous weather outside, and how Will needed to move his things to the room his parents were sharing, so he'd have a place to get ready that was well away from the main suite. No worries, he said with a grin. I'm already packed and ready to go. Rosemary wrinkled her nose. I still think it's kind of a silly custom for us not to see each other get dressed. It's not silly, Isabel replied, her tone verging on severe. No peeking behind the curtain, okay? Okay, Will said, still smiling. I like a surprise as much as anyone. They all ate their fill of the assorted goodies, and by the time they were done, the movers had appeared, ready to set up all the tables and chairs. Isabel and Glynis headed out to supervise, while Will's parents took over cleanup duty, making sure any leftovers were safely stowed in the fridge or the pantry. Audrey took Rosemary by the arm and told her it was time to head upstairs. That seemed a little extreme to Will, since the ceremony wouldn't even start until 4:30, but he decided to let it go. After all, most of this was for the bride, not the groom. He and Michael and Fred had already decided to kill some time by wandering around downtown Santa Barbara until it was close enough to the ceremony that they could come back to the mansion and get changed, and he had to admit it felt good to be someplace he didn't know very well, to take in the shops and the restaurants and the museums, and breathe in some more of that marvelous sea air. They stopped for a beer at a bar that faced out toward the ocean. Will hadn't been so sure about that element of their afternoon activities, although both Fred and Michael assured him that one beer wasn't going to make any difference. It'll be worn off before you even start getting into your suit, Fred added, which Will supposed was the truth. Beer was a lot lower octane than wine or spirits. All the same, he was careful to get a lager and not something heavier with a higher alcohol content. Because it was a mild and sunny day, the other two ordered similar brews, and soon enough they were sitting at a table separated from the beach by only a low fence. I could get used to this, Fred remarked as he gazed out at the waves, frosted with foam before they made their way to shore, and Michael lifted an eyebrow. I thought you liked Glendora. I do, Fred replied. And I know there's no way Isabel would ever want to move, not with her business and her family right there. Still, there's something about the beach. True enough. Fred had sold his house in Redlands, which he'd inherited from his mother, who had passed a few years earlier, when he and Isabel got engaged, since his was the kind of work he could do anywhere. And although Rosemary wasn't living in Glendora anymore, Pasadena wasn't all that far away. With their parents sandwiched in between in small, quaint Sierra Madre, the family could range up and down the 210 freeway as they needed, and everyone agreed the setup was working very well. Last time I was in Santa Barbara, I was performing an exorcism, Michael said, and his expression darkened a bit. I'm glad this whole thing at Vista de los Robles turned out a little better. That was for sure. Will hadn't been there, but he'd heard about the terrible incident that had taken place nearly 3 years ago now, when the Project Demon Hunters team had been filming the exorcism, and the demon had escaped its initial victim and taken up residence in one of the production team. It had turned out that Susan Loomis wasn't as squeaky clean as she'd looked and had been consorting with the enemy for decades, but still, her accidental death was what shut down the show for good. Yes, they'd had a much better outcome this time. But I probably shouldn't be rehashing ancient history, Michael went on. The important thing is that we won this round. To winning, Fred said, and they all clinked their beer bottles together. And a long, happy, boring future, Michael added while Will grinned. I don't know about boring, he said. Let's go with uneventful, shall we? I'll drink to that, Michael replied, and they all took large swallows of beer. Yes, Will thought he was ready for some peace and quiet, although he guessed that would have to wait until after the wedding. The demon might have been sent back where he belonged, but that didn't mean there wasn't going to be a lot of commotion at the mansion tonight. which was as it should be.
Rosemary honestly hadn't seen how it could take hours and hours to get ready for the wedding, but she hadn't reckoned on the hairstylist who'd taken the greater part of 2 hours just to get her masses of curly hair ironed out so it could be reworked into looser, more manageable curls, or the makeup artist who seemed to need almost as much time to polish her face to the same level of perfection as her hair. Audrey and her sisters had insisted that they could do their own hair and makeup, and they got ready in the bathroom while Rosemary sat at the little table by the window, fussed over like the Hollywood royalty who'd first built this house. At last, though, she was deemed ready, and Isabel and her mother helped her into her wedding dress, which was made of fine silk with delicate beading around the low neckline, and which had a floaty skirt and long draped sleeves, making her feel like the Queen of Elfland. No tiara or veil, only a delicate headpiece in a design of twined leaves cast in silvery metal and decorated with freshwater pearls. "You look so beautiful," her mother said, reaching up to dab at her eyes. "Don't ruin your makeup, Mom," Celeste warned, although she was smiling. Like Audrey and Isabel, she wore a boho version of a bridesmaid's dress, fine silk and a pale sea green, with bell sleeves and a tiered skirt, her curly hair tamed into a French braid. Glynis waved a hand. "Oh, no one's going to be looking at me. But I'm fine. It's just, this day has been a long time coming." Yes, it had. Neither Rosemary nor Will had really planned on such a long engagement. It had just turned out that way for various reasons. And since Isabel and Fred had gotten married in Las Vegas with a minimum of fuss, it had been going on 6 years since Rosemary's mother had been able to see one of her daughters in a wedding dress. Now it was time to descend the stairs, meet her father at the door, and walk out onto the terrace, already set up with tables and chairs for the guests, and while the trio they'd hired softly played Pachelbel's canon, to head down the runner of soft rose-colored fabric that ran between her seated family and friends. They felt like a blur to her, though, all those watching people. No, she only had eyes for Will, standing up front with Michael and Fred and Kevin next to him, her sisters and Audrey ranged on the other side. How fine he looked in that charcoal gray suit, with a pale seafoam green tie at his throat, somehow enhancing the clear crystal hue of his eyes. Sure, he wore a dark jacket and dress pants when working at the church, but somehow, this didn't feel the same. And now she stood next to him, and listened in a haze to the shortened version of the Anglican ceremony they'd decided on months ago. Will had asked her if she wanted to write her own vows, but she'd told him that wasn't necessary, that she knew it was important to him to speak the words from the church he loved so much. It didn't matter to her as long as they were married in the end. Which they were, with Will sliding the white gold band with its tiny winking diamonds onto her finger next to the antique diamond engagement ring he'd given her so many months earlier, followed by the strength of his lips against hers as they kissed. So utterly perfect, and somehow she knew this moment had taken on extra significance because of the demon they'd vanquished the night before. They'd all worked together, proving to her once again how strong her family was, how important they were to her. And now Will was part of that family as well. Equally blurry was the reception that followed. Rosemary knew the food was excellent, and the band played just the right mix of danceable songs and slower, more atmospheric pieces that allowed people to take a break and just relax for a moment. The sun set over the Pacific, and the patio heaters that had been set out among the tables were turned on by the catering staff to ward against the chilly ocean breeze, and then it was time to cut the cake and drink more champagne, and to wonder if she'd ever been surrounded by this many happy, smiling people before, family and friends new and old, like Penny and Isaac, come from Santa Fe to offer their good wishes and hopes for a happy future. Eventually, though, it was time for the evening to end, and for her and Will to climb the stairs to their suite. She knew her family would remain behind to usher their guests to their cars and to make sure no personal items had been left behind, but for now it was only her and her new husband, standing alone in a gorgeous room that would have swallowed up their own bedroom at home at least 3 times over. "I've never seen anyone as beautiful as you," Will said simply, and she had to smile. "Well, a whole team did this for me, so I'm not sure I can take much credit." His mouth quirked. "Oh yes you can. Because you're just as beautiful when you're wandering around the house in one of those silly oversized t-shirts with your hair in a scrunchie." Should she try to argue with him? No chance at all, because he came to her then and took her in his arms, kissing her deeply. And then it was time to pull the ornament from her hair, and to carefully extricate herself from the elaborate gown, all so they could fall to the bed and kiss again and again, shifting into making love so gradually she hardly noticed what was happening, only that they had joined body to body, and she knew this was the first time they'd ever made love as husband and wife. The first time, true, but definitely not the last. Brunch the next morning was wonderful, with a bewildering variety of foods ranging from eggs Benedict to Belgian waffles to huevos rancheros. But by 1 o'clock the meal was over and everyone had begun to scatter, with Rosemary's family packing up and heading back to the San Gabriel Valley, and Will's parents preparing to drive over to their hotel in Santa Barbara's downtown. In fact, he'd gone with them, understanding that they wanted to spend a little more time with their son. Of course they'd invited Rosemary, but she'd demurred, letting them know she needed some quiet and peace after being around so many people. Although she'd never tried to claim she was an empath, she also couldn't deny that crowds became overwhelming to her after a while, and a couple of hours of calm were just what she needed, right after all the hubbub of the day before. Will and his parents had been gone less than 20 minutes when someone knocked at the door. A little irritated, Rosemary set down her book and wondered if she should ignore it. But no, the mansion wasn't the kind of place where solicitors would generally come, and it had been an ordinary-sounding knock, not the ominous 3 in a row she'd heard her first night here. Most likely, it was someone on the catering staff coming back to reclaim an item they'd left behind. She hadn't noticed anything like that, but she also hadn't been paying much attention to details, leaving that sort of thing up to her mother and Isabel. When she opened the door, however, it was to find Priscilla St. John standing outside. "I was hoping we could talk," the woman said, dispensing with any kind of greeting. "Oh, I think we have a whole lot to talk about," Rosemary thought, but she managed to say politely, "Please come in. I was just sitting down in the family room." The two women walked down the hallway to the room in question. Once there, Priscilla said, "It's gone, isn't it?" Nothing like getting right to the heart of the matter.
"Yes," Rosemary replied.
"We took care of it Friday night, right after the solstice." Priscilla nodded. "I thought that's when it happened. My mother died at the exact same time." For a woman who just lost a close relative, Ms. St. John didn't appear terribly upset. Still, Rosemary rushed to say, "I'm so sorry." A thin smile touched the older woman's lips. "No need to be. She was a terrible person." Rosemary blinked. It seemed that Priscilla St. John didn't have too much of a problem with speaking ill of the dead. She was the one who summoned it all those years ago. But she couldn't get rid of it. All she could do was run away. They were still connected, though. Finding her voice, Rosemary asked, "And you think that's why she passed at the same time the demon was sent back to hell?" "I know it." Priscilla paused there, as though searching for her next words. "And I know it was terrible of me not to disclose what was going on here, but I didn't have many options. My mother had told me the only chance of getting rid of the demon was to have a professional do it." Rosemary crossed her arms. "You could have just called Michael, you know. This is the sort of thing he does." A twist of her lips, and Priscilla said, "It wasn't that easy. The demon always came and went, and after a few disasters, I realized that it was only drawn here when there was a wedding, just like the one all those years ago when my mother first summoned it to spite her sister. That meant we had to stage a real wedding to bring it back out into the open." Maybe all that was true. Still. But how did you even know Will was connected to Michael Covenant? Still wearing that crooked smile, Priscilla replied, "My mother knew. Don't ask me how. She was obsessed with anyone in that field. Kept manila folders of information lying all over her house. And she gave me a list of names to keep an eye out for, just in case they ever contacted me to rent the mansion for some reason. I thought it was a long shot, but—" The words trailed off, and her shoulders lifted. Just like the other times Rosemary had seen her, Priscilla St. John wore an expensive knit suit, possibly from the company that bore her same last name, even though of course they couldn't be connected, and didn't have a hair out of place. Had she been lurking nearby, waiting for Rosemary to be alone so they could talk privately? It probably didn't matter that much. But my brother-in-law found this place for us, she said, and when Will and I reached out, you realized you finally had a chance to get rid of the demon. Exactly. Priscilla stopped there, and for the first time, she looked almost uncertain. I know it wasn't a good thing to do to you, but I had to get rid of that creature. Corporate retreats are all fine and good, but they don't bring in the same kind of money as weddings. The upkeep on this place was bleeding me dry, and my mother had made me swear that I would never sell it. So I went ahead and hoped for the best. And had been rewarded for her lying and manipulation, since the house was now cleansed and Priscilla could rent it out to as many wedding parties as she liked. I'll send you a partial refund, she offered, and now it was Rosemary's turn to wear a crooked smile. Don't bother, she said. Epilogue. Rosemary curled up on the couch next to Will, a mug of hot cocoa warming her fingers. Their Christmas tree, not nearly as fancy as the one at Vista de los Robles, but much more homey, twinkled in the corner and cast a friendly glow over the pile of wedding gifts they'd finally gotten around to opening. Her parents had transported the presents back to their house after the ceremony, and then brought them over after they knew the newlyweds were safely home from Santa Barbara. This was something she and Will had planned to do once they'd realized how close to Christmas they would be getting married, to open all their gifts on Christmas Eve, since they knew they'd be spending Christmas Day at John and Glynis's house in Sierra Madre, where the rest of the family would be gathering as well. And her parents had given them a very special present when they went to collect everything, a check for $25,000, which Rosemary knew would go straight into the remodeling fund. Maybe she'd be able to convince Will to put in a powder room after all, even though he'd tried to argue that 2 bathrooms would be more than sufficient. This one's from Michael and Audrey, Will said, passing her a carefully wrapped package. She pulled off the paper to reveal an antique leather-bound book with faded gold stamping on the spine, and couldn't quite resist making a face. Only Michael Covenant would think an old demon hunting book would be an appropriate wedding present. Will chuckled. Hey, those things come in more handy than you might think. About all Rosemary could do was stick her tongue out at him. Underneath the book, however, was a gift certificate to their favorite fancy restaurant in Pasadena, the kind of place they rarely visited because they really couldn't afford it. Bet I know who got us that part of the present, she remarked, and now it was Will's turn to smile. They worked their way through the pile of gifts, keeping careful track of who had sent them what so they'd have accurate records when it came time to write all those thank you notes. At the bottom of the pile, though, Rosemary found a small, unmarked box. That's strange, she murmured, turning it over in her hands. Most of the boxes they'd received had been much bigger than this, since they'd contained useful items for the house, including a gorgeous set of deep green Le Creuset pans she'd been coveting for a long time, Brad and Leslie Gordon's contribution. I don't remember this one being among the stuff we piled into Mom and Dad's car as they were leaving Santa Barbara. Will frowned. Maybe it's a Christmas present that got mixed in with the others somehow. That seemed to be the most logical explanation, although the silver and white paper and silvery box definitely looked to Rosemary more like wedding wrappings than anything you'd use for a Christmas present. Well, maybe the contents of the box would provide a clue. She carefully removed the paper and lifted the lid. Inside was a delicate silver butterfly pendant set with a series of tiny flashing diamonds, hanging from an equally delicate chain. As she lifted it out, a small card fluttered to the floor. Will picked it up, brows drawing together as he opened the piece of folded cardstock to read the inscription inside. It just says C. Was the pendant from her sister Celeste? No, that didn't make any sense. She and Kevin had gotten the newlyweds a set of mixing bowls and a wonderful marble board with a matching marble rolling pin. No one else among the guests had a first name that started with the letter C. Honestly, she didn't think she knew anyone with that first initial, except... Cold crept its way down Rosemary's spine. It can't be. Will must have picked up on her vibe because he said firmly, hand reaching out to take hers, it's not possible. He's gone. You know there has to be some other explanation for that present. Rosemary made herself nod, but she couldn't quite shake the queasy feeling in her stomach as she stared at the pendant, its tiny diamonds glinting in the reflected light from the Christmas tree. "You're right. Of course you're right." With her free hand, she set the necklace aside, forcing a smile as she snuggled closer to Will. But even after they cleared away all the wrapping paper and boxes, and set the unwrapped gifts under the tree, Rosemary's gaze kept drifting back to the innocent-looking silver pendant where it lay on the coffee table. She didn't want to think about what its presence might mean. All is revealed in Speak of the Devil, the first book in the Vegas Slayers series, set in the same universe as Project Demon Hunters.
If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe. New audiobooks are posted every week.